This episode is not. There are few stories that are as difficult to comprehend as the one I'm about to share with you today. How anyone could allow something like this to happen is just beyond me. This episode is not going to be gratuitously violent, however, it is going to be highly disturbing. As such, viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast because that's all we do. And we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to mount the 5-star review button's brand new 75-inch TV to their wall. But when you do, purposefully miss all of the studs. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Rachel Berkheimer was born on January 16, 1984 in Everett, Washington, which is a city that is located 25 miles north of Seattle and sits on the banks of the Puget Sound, which is a large inlet of the Pacific Ocean. At the time of her birth, Rachel's parents, Bill and Denise, already had one child, a daughter named Megan, and so when Rachel arrived, they decided their family was complete. Initially, there was some concern that Rachel could have some health issues because by the time she was 2.5 years old, she still was not talking, and so her parents were concerned she could be deaf. But shortly after they went to a specialist about her hearing, Rachel would say her first words, and then from that point onward, her parents could not get her to be quiet. As a youngster, Rachel had a huge imagination. In preschool, she would pretend her fingers were imaginary friends and she would speak to them during class, often getting in trouble because of this. She also had a prized collection of troll dolls, who she gave very intricate backstories to. By the time Rachel was in grade school, she had developed a keen sense of humor. Specifically, she had the gift of mimicry. She could basically become any of her friends or her family members, and everyone thought it was really funny. In addition to her bubbly personality, Rachel was also a very gifted athlete who was always one of the very best players on her basketball, soccer, volleyball, or track team. All this despite growing to be only 4 foot 11 inches tall. Speaking of her smaller stature, even though she was not self-conscious about it, Rachel did wear 4-inch platform shoes virtually everywhere she went, including just going out to the mailbox. In high school, unsurprisingly, Rachel became very popular. Her father joked that he was her answering machine because her many friends would call the house day and night looking for her. But despite this abundance of friends, Rachel took all of her relationships very seriously. She never forgot anybody's birthday, and she would even sometimes send out these random cards that weren't even on birthdays to her friends and to her family members, just telling them how much she loved them. By 2001, when Rachel was 17 years old and in her 3rd year of high school, it just seemed like she was this amazing person who was destined to live a totally charmed life. However, this would not last. Of all of her friends, Rachel's best friend was an 18-year-old boy named Corey Haynes. She had met him when they were young, and they had quickly become soulmates, at least according to their families. However, their relationship was not a romantic one. It was more of a brother-sister style relationship. They spent nearly all of their time together, and in the rare times they were not together, they could always be found speaking on the phone. In the summer following Rachel's 3rd year of high school, Corey was riding in a car with 3 other students from his and Rachel's school. Rachel was not with them. And at some point, the driver of the vehicle lost control of it and started to flip off the road. And when it finally came to a stop 100 feet away from the road, Corey and one of the other student passengers, a 17-year-old named Levi Whiting, were both unfortunately deceased. When Rachel heard the news about this crash, she fell apart. Not only was Corey literally her best friend in the world, but she was also very close with Levi as well. And so over the rest of that awful summer, Rachel spent most of her time crying in her bedroom, looking at pictures of her and Corey and her and Levi. Her older sister, Megan, would say that Rachel was just beyond heartbroken. It was like all of the joy and happiness that normally characterized her was just gone. Finally, that summer did come to an end, and it was time for Rachel to return to Marysville-Pilchuck High School to begin her fourth and final year. Her family hoped that finally being around some other students again would help heal her and help her move on, but unbelievably, over the course of that school year, 4 more students, all of whom were friends with Rachel, would die. There was a suicide, there was a drowning, a hit and run, and an accidental shooting. It was like the school was cursed. By the second half of that school year, Rachel, like many other students at the school, had become deeply depressed. The trauma of losing so many people close to her had just crushed her spirit. When her grades, which were normally quite good, began to decline dramatically, her parents pulled her from the high school and enrolled her in an alternative high school. They also began sending her to grief counseling. But not long after joining this alternative high school did Rachel drop out, so she did not get her high school diploma. Her parents were not happy about this decision, but they did understand their child's life had been completely disrupted in a catastrophic way over the past year. I mean, the trauma she had experienced already as this young person was more than what most adults would experience in their entire lifetime. And so they honored their daughter's decision to drop out, and they just gave her some space to try to figure out what she wanted to do next. After dropping out of school in the spring of 2002, Rachel got a job at a local pizza and pasta shop in town, but after only a couple of months, she quit. She did pick up some hours babysitting that summer, but for the most part, she spent her time just sitting in her room, alone and sad. Then one day, her father looked at the family's phone bill and saw it was significantly higher than normal. When he reviewed all of the individual charges, he saw there was one that really stood out to him. There were dozens and dozens of collect calls that had been placed from an inmate at a correctional facility. When he confronted his daughter about these calls, she would tell him that yes, she was speaking to an inmate at a correctional facility, and his name was John Anderson. He was 20 years old. He went by Diggy, that was his nickname, and that she and Diggy were in this sort of new romantic relationship. She told her father that she had met Diggy a year earlier at a high school party. This was before he was sent to jail on drug and burglary charges, and he had been very interested in her at the time, but she wasn't interested in him. Despite the rejection, though, Diggy continued to pursue Rachel well after this party, but it wasn't until a year later, when she had dropped out of high school, that she finally decided to give him a shot. Rachel would tell her father that Diggy, despite being a convicted criminal, was very misunderstood. He was actually a very nice guy who just had a troubled past, and that was why he kept getting in trouble with the law. Her father did not approve and was very worried about his daughter, but he wanted to be supportive and felt like he didn't really know the whole situation, and so he just told her, please just be careful. Not long after this father-daughter talk, Diggy got out of prison, and so Rachel, who had spent the better part of the last year shut up in her room, was now suddenly going out all the time to see him and his group of friends. It's important to understand here that Diggy and his group of friends were in reality just a group of petty criminals and drug dealers for the most part. However, they thought of themselves as a full-fledged, organized criminal gang, and they were very proud of it. And they even referred to themselves as the Northwest Mafia, and Diggy was very clearly their leader. Quickly, it became apparent to Rachel's family that a big part of, quote, spending time with Diggy and the Northwest Mafia was partying and doing drugs and drinking alcohol. And so naturally, the parents were very concerned for their daughter, who they felt was really starting to go down the wrong path in life. So over the next couple of months, Rachel's parents and her sister all tried to gently convince Rachel to stop spending so much time with Diggy and his crew because they were a totally bad influence on her. But Rachel was adamant that Diggy and his crew was making her happy, and that right now that was what she needed, that she needed to be around them, that they were really just awesome people, and that you got to trust her. And her family, they didn't trust her. They felt like, maybe she's going through a phase where she wants to date, a bad boy. They didn't really get it, but they also didn't have a way of getting through to her. It seemed like she was just convinced this is what she needed to be doing now, and so they just were kind of at a loss. Then, one day, it seemed like everything had just magically fallen into place. It was on a sunny morning in late July of that year. Rachel's father was outside working on his garden when his daughter, Rachel, suddenly appeared looking happier than she had in a long time. Bill smiled back at her and was like, "What's going on? Why are you so happy?" and she would tell him that she had a plan. She was going back to school and she was going to become a medical technician. And she was just absolutely beaming as she's telling him this news. When she was asked what had brought about this incredible change, she explained that she had recently made a new friend who was encouraging her to do this. She said his name was Maurice Rivas. He was 18 years old like she was, and he was a part of the Northwest Mafia. She told her dad that she had previously interacted with him when she first started seeing Diggy a few months earlier, but she had never really had a real conversation with him. She'd only just kind of waved and said hi whenever they were at gatherings together. But a few days earlier, when she was at a Northwest Mafia party, she and Maurice just kind of happened to find themselves alone, and so they struck up a friendly conversation. And during that talk, Maurice confided in Rachel that he was actually really unhappy and he wanted to leave the Northwest Mafia and he wanted to go back to school since he had actually dropped out of high school as well. And when Rachel heard him say this, she had an epiphany. She realized she felt exactly the way he did. She didn't like being in the Northwest Mafia. She didn't even know why she was in the Northwest Mafia. She didn't know why she was seeing Diggy. And it was like it all clicked for her. And so she confided in Maurice, this guy who she barely knew. She said, you know what? I feel the same way. I don't want to spend time with these people. I want to go back to school. And so this random conversation they had at this party really immediately bonded them together. It was like they both had been harboring this deep, dark secret, but now only with each other, they could discuss it openly. And it was very liberating for them. And so by the end of this first real conversation they had had, the pair had promised each other that they were going to get out of the Northwest Mafia. They were going to go back to school. They were going to clean up their acts. They were going to fix their lives. And they were going to do it together. They were going to support each other and have each other's back. Rachel would even joke with her father that they were already talking about when they went back to school that they would go to senior prom together, although she assured her dad that their relationship was totally platonic. This was not a romantic thing. Bill, her father, had no idea what to say. This was literally the best case scenario. It was the thing her family had been hoping for over these last several months, and it seemed like it was finally happening. And so he told Rachel he was so proud of her. He gave her a big hug and said, look, if you need anything, just let me know. And Rachel smiled and she gave him a hug back. And then she turned around and skipped back inside the house. And sure enough, over the next 2 months, Rachel did act very differently. She started very intentionally getting her life back together. She started spending more time at home with her family, and she started going to church with her mom, and she also began reconnecting with some of her older high school friends who had always been a positive influence on her. And so by September of that year, Rachel did seem like she was more or less back to her old happy self. Except there was one element of her life, of her old life, so to speak, that she was not able to shake. And that was her relationship with Diggy. She just could not end it. She had tried to, but apparently he didn't want to break up. And so they fell into this sort of weird on and off again relationship that kept Rachel periodically going back to these Northwest Mafia gatherings. Her family was obviously unhappy about this particular detail, but they did feel confident that given her recent changes, that she would eventually break it off for good with Diggy. And so until that happened, they were actually quietly grateful that her new friend Maurice was also still spending time with the Northwest Mafia. He too was kind of struggling to fully break contact with them. And so the family was thinking, well, yeah, they do need to leave, but for the time being, when they're at these gatherings, at least they'll have each other. On September 23rd of that year, Rachel was invited to a Northwest Mafia get-together, and she did agree to go. Before she left her house, she did not give her family very much information about what she was doing or where she was going. All they knew was that apparently she was going out to see some friends. And so that night, when Rachel did not come back home, her family was definitely concerned about her, but they assumed she must have made plans to stay out at this friend or friend's house for the night. And since she didn't have a cell phone, they couldn't call her to confirm that, and so they just had to wait until the next day to see if she would show up again. But the next day arrived, and Rachel did not show up again. And when her family began calling around to her various friends' houses, both old and new, no one seemed to know where she was. For a couple of days, the family continued to call around town and even drove around town putting up posters, asking people to come forward if they had seen her, but there was no sign of her. And so finally, on September 27th, the family went to police and they officially reported Rachel missing. The police immediately jumped into action, sending out units to scour all corners of Everett, Washington, and the surrounding areas. They also began questioning virtually anyone who was even remotely affiliated with Rachel in hopes they might know something. But despite this really aggressive initial push by police, it led to nothing. Then, out of nowhere, someone very unexpected came forward and gave the police a huge tip. And this tip would ultimately lead police to discover the truly unbelievable story of what happened to Rachel. The following is that story. After leaving her house on the afternoon of September 23rd, the day she told her family she was going to see friends, Rachel made the short drive over to 16-year-old Nathan Lovelace's house. He was going to be the host for that evening's get-together with the Northwest Mafia. When she arrived, Nathan, along with Rachel's good friend Maurice and a 17-year-old named Matthew Durham, were sitting in the living room, and while they waited for more friends of theirs to arrive, Nathan's father suddenly came home. Apparently, he had gotten off work early, and so not wanting to hang out around the prying eyes of a parent, the trio decided it would be better if they just left and spent their night at someone else's house. And so they made their way over to Kevin Jihad's house. Kevin was a 32-year-old, and he owned his own place. When they arrived, they found Kevin, along with 22-year-olds John Whitaker and Jeffrey Barth, and 20-year-old Tony Williams, all sitting around in the living room, just kind of joking around. They're playing video games, they're drinking alcohol, and they're smoking marijuana. Rachel, along with Maurice, Nathan, and Matthew, just took up spots on the couch right near the entrance to the room, and before long, they were joking around and having a good time too. At 4 p.m., Rachel's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Diggy, stormed into Kevin's living room looking furious. Without warning, he punched two of the guys sitting nearest Rachel, and then he pulled out a gun and he began aiming it wildly around the room. And this instantly silenced the group because no one knew what he was on about. And Rachel, who's sitting right near the door, she does not want to be part of this, and she's thinking this has nothing to do with me, and so she decides she's going to get up and kind of slip out and let them deal with Diggy and whatever is going on in here. And so she stands up, trying to be as quiet and small as she can, and she begins edging towards the door. But in order to fully leave the living room and escape this situation, she would need to walk right past Diggy, who was standing in the doorway. And as she got closer to him, about to make that move out of the room, Diggy seemed to notice her, and he put his gun down, and he turned to face her, and then he turned his whole body so he was squared up with Rachel, as if he was getting ready to fight her. And then Rachel just kind of tried to make herself as small and as timid as she possibly could, and she tried to just slip past him, but right as she did, Diggy reached out with his left hand, and he grabbed her scalp, he grabbed her hair, and then he wound up and he blasted her in the face with his right hand, and then with his left, he kind of chucked her back into the room she had just tried to escape from. And then the worst night of Rachel's life would begin. As soon as she hit the floor in that room, she tried to scramble back to her feet, but before she could, she was getting punched and kicked by Diggy and several other of her friends who had just been sitting in the room joking around with her, and then the others who were in the room who were not actively participating in beating her, which included Maurice Rivas. They sat there idly doing nothing while Rachel screamed for their help. When her screams got so loud, Diggy was concerned the neighbors would hear her. One of the idle onlookers in the room, 20-year-old Tony Williams, simply turned the music up to drown her screams out. After a few horrible, violent minutes, Diggy told the others to stop, at which point he reached down and he grabbed Rachel's hair again and dragged her out of the room, and then he dragged her across the kitchen floor and through a door that led into the garage. Once she was inside the garage, he jammed a dirty sock into her mouth and he covered her mouth over with duct tape, and then he bound her wrists and her body with rope, and then once he was certain she could neither make any noise or go anywhere, he pushed her over so she was laying on her side all bound up, and then he just left. He went back into the house and back into the living room with the others. What Rachel was not aware of was this entire night was a setup. Diggy was furious with her, most likely due to a combination of rage that she had tried to break up with him and just jealousy that she was now showing affection to other men in the group, such as Maurice and a few others. And so Diggy had ordered the other members of the Northwest Mafia to help put her in her place. It was unclear exactly what he meant by this, but all of the Mafia members knew this meant physically harming Rachel in some way, and they agreed to it. Originally, the plan had been to lure her to Nathan's house under the false pretenses of just a normal night hanging out with some friends, and then at some point, Nathan, Matthew, and her close friend Maurice would abduct her and bring her to Diggy for whatever else he had planned for her. But Nathan's dad had come home early before they could enact their plan. And so when that happened, Nathan had to sneak off and privately call Diggy and ask what to do next. And Diggy, who was totally frustrated by this, just said, you know what, bring her to Kevin's house and we will all deal with her when she gets here. So when Rachel sat down on the couch in Kevin's house next to Maurice and her other friends, who she thought she was just enjoying a fun night out with, in reality, they were all acting. They were trying to act like this was just another night and kind of get her off guard so that when Diggy came storming into the room pretending to be mad, which was the sign, they would all attack her. But now that the plan had worked and Rachel had fallen into their trap and had gotten badly beaten up and was restrained and helpless in the garage, Diggy didn't have a plan for what they were going to do next. So instead of doing anything, the 8 guys who had just beaten up and restrained Rachel just simply went back to doing drugs and drinking and playing video games in the living room. Then, a few hours later at 9 p.m., Kevin's girlfriend, Trissa Connor, she came home, and when she did, she entered the house through the garage. And when she saw Rachel laying on the ground, restrained, badly beaten up, her left eye is totally swollen, she ran over to her because, one, she actually didn't know who Rachel was. So this is just a random girl in her garage that's beaten up and restrained. And so she runs over to her, she rips the tape off of her mouth, she pulls the sock out, and right away, Rachel is pleading with her to let her go, she won't tell anyone, and Trissa is totally confused because she really has no clue what's going on. She was not a part of the plan to harm this girl, and so Trissa just instinctively runs into the house. She does not make any contact with the guys in the living room. She goes straight into the kitchen and she gets a knife, and then she runs back into the garage and she begins cutting through all of Rachel's restraints to free her. But before she could finish the job, Diggy apparently had heard the commotion of Trissa coming in and heard her running around the house. And so Diggy comes storming into the garage. He sees what Trissa is doing. He runs over and he grabs her hands and he physically stops her from freeing Rachel. And then he threatens Trissa that he's going to harm her if she lets Rachel go. And so Trissa, amazingly, at this point, despite clearly seeing something very bad is happening to this girl, instead of continuing to try to fight this and figure out what's going on and maybe try to help this girl, she just gets mad at Diggy and says, I don't want this in my house. What are you doing? I don't want this girl in my house. You know what? I'm going to call the cops if you don't get rid of her. Meaning, I don't care what you do with her, but I don't want this in my house. I don't want to be involved with whatever this is. And then she promptly begins to leave Rachel alone with Diggy. She starts walking away, and Rachel, she's heartbroken. This was her way out. She was about to be let go, and now Trissa is leaving her behind. And so Rachel's begging her to come back. Please, you gotta let me go. But Trissa didn't listen. She walked into the house and shut the door behind her. And then Diggy, who was still in the garage, he just immediately turned around. He tied Rachel back up. He stuffed the sock back in her mouth. He taped her shut. And then he went right back into the house and shut the door, leaving Rachel all alone again. But a few minutes later, Diggy would come back, this time with John Whitaker, and the two of them would show up with this black duffel bag, this huge bag. And they walk over to Rachel, who's now whimpering in the corner. She'd kind of pushed herself to the side. And they lifted her up and they forced her small body into this black bag, and then they zipped it shut. And while they did this, Matthew Durham, who had been in the living room, he had gone outside and gotten his red Jeep, and he had backed it up to the closed garage door. And then once Diggy and John had Rachel secured in this bag, They opened the garage door up and they put her in the back of the Jeep and they shut the Jeep's back door. And then Diggy ordered John, along with Matthew and Rachel's friend Maurice, who had just come outside, to just go drive around town with Rachel in the trunk until he, Diggy, figured out what they were going to do next. And so the trio hopped in the red Jeep and did what their leader told them to do. They began driving around Everett with Rachel in the trunk, and this whole time Rachel could clearly hear anything that was said inside of the vehicle, but apparently during this initial drive around, the trio didn't talk. So it's unclear if she understood who was actually with her. But eventually, during this drive around, one of the three young men in the Jeep got a call from Diggy, who told them he had his plan, so come pick him up. At this point, the trio decide, for whatever reason, to just dump Rachel somewhere, basically stash her somewhere in her bag, and go pick up Diggy. And then once they had Diggy, they would go back, they would get Rachel, and then they would figure out what they were going to do. They'd hear the plan that Diggy had in store. And so Matthew drove the red Jeep about 10 miles north of Everett to a quiet cul-de-sac in this suburban neighborhood. And then once the Jeep was stopped, Matthew and Maurice got out and they went around to the back of the Jeep, they opened it up, and they pulled Rachel out of the trunk and they walked her over and put her behind some big tree on someone's front property. Now, it's nighttime, this was not a well-lit up area, and so they thought by putting her behind this tree, she'd be out of sight of the road and, no one would see her. And they also decided that one of them would need to stay back and guard her to make sure she didn't escape or that nobody did accidentally find her. And they decided Maurice would be the one who would stay back and do that. And so after Rachel has been planted behind this tree, Maurice made his way over and he sat down next to her. And then Matthew and John, they just drove off in the Jeep to go get Diggy. And so once the Jeep had driven off, Rachel, who could clearly hear their discussions and she could hear the Jeep pulling off, she knows she is now alone with her good friend Maurice. And so this is her opportunity to plead with him to help her. And so as soon as she hears that Jeep is gone, she starts screaming through her gag on her mouth to try to get his attention, and it worked. Maurice quickly unzipped the bag and pulled her gag off, but he didn't untie her. And right away, Rachel, she is so upset, she's frantic, and she says to Maurice, "They're gonna kill me if you don't get me out of here. You have to free me." And Maurice was just very nonchalant, and he said, "Yeah, I think you're making a big deal about this. You're going to be fine. Just go along with it. It's not a big deal." But Rachel couldn't believe what she was hearing. And so she's saying, "Maurice, don't you get it? They are going to kill me. This is the chance. Let me out. Save me. You're supposed to be my friend. Let me go." But Maurice just continued to do nothing. He just kept telling her it wasn't a big deal. She was blowing this up out of proportion. And then at some point, Rachel, after quite a bit of time had passed, and now she's thinking, Diggy and the others, they're going to be back soon. And so she says to Maurice, "You know what? If they're going to kill me, I just don't want to be drowned. I'm terrified of being drowned. At least make them shoot me. Make it quick." And at this, Maurice just doesn't say anything. And instead, he reaches down and he grabs the sock and he puts it in Rachel's mouth. He puts the tape over her mouth and then he presses her down into the bag and he zips it shut. And then he waits for Diggy and the others to come back. And sure enough, just a couple of minutes later, Matthew, John, and Diggy returned in the Jeep to the cul-de-sac. They got out and they lifted Rachel up inside of the bag and they brought her back over and put her in the trunk of the Jeep, which now contained 4 new shovels. And then once the trunk was shut, all 4 men piled inside as well. And then Diggy told Matthew to head out to a particular off-roading spot he was familiar with. It was about 30 miles to the northeast. And over the course of this hour-long drive, Rachel could hear everything being said inside of this Jeep. And she would have heard all the details of exactly what Diggy had planned for her. And so she knows what's going to happen to her, but she can't do anything about it. She's just bound in the back of this Jeep. And so around midnight, they reached their destination, this off-roading site, which was basically this thick forest at the foot of a mountain near a small pond. And once they parked, the men got out, leaving Rachel in the trunk with the trunk shut, and they began walking around the back of the vehicle and started looking on the ground until Diggy said he had found a spot that he really liked, and it was about 10 or 15 feet behind the vehicle. And so once this spot was identified, the men walked back to the Jeep, they opened up the trunk, and they left Rachel, but they pulled out their shovels. Diggy, John, and Matthew, they all took their shovels and walked to this designated spot on the ground, and they began digging, but Maurice didn't. He stayed back at the Jeep, standing right against the trunk with Rachel right behind him. So again, he has this opportunity where, in theory, he could help Rachel, but while she whimpered behind him and tried to get his attention and tried to get him to help her, he just ignored her, and he pulled out a cigarette and he began smoking, and he also had a soda that he was drinking. And so he's just standing there doing nothing. And at some point, Diggy looks up and notices this, and he yells at Maurice to come help them, get your shovel and start digging. And so Maurice, reluctantly, puts his cigarette out, throws his soda can away, and then he grabbed the last remaining shovel, and then he walked away from Rachel and the Jeep over to this site, and he began to dig as well. For the next 30 minutes or so, Rachel, who's still in the trunk is open, she's still in the bag, she's forced to listen to the sound of these 4 people dig what sounds like a very sizable hole. And then when they finally stopped digging, she heard them chuck their shovels aside and start walking back over to her. And when they reached her, they unzipped the bag and they pulled her out and they sat her down on the back of this Jeep. So she's kind of sitting, looking in the direction of this dig site. And as they begin cutting off her restraints and removing the tape from her mouth, she gets a clear view of what they had been digging, and she knows immediately what it is. They were digging her grave. After all the restraints and everything was off of her, Diggy ordered John to start taking all of her clothes and jewelry off. Rachel knew at this point she was about to die. There was nothing she could do to stop it. She was outnumbered. She was in the middle of nowhere. She would have been overpowered. So she knows she's going to die. And so she had nothing to lose. And so when John grabbed her and tried to rip her clothes off, she fought back aggressively. And she looks at Diggy and she says, "At least allow me the dignity of removing my clothes and jewelry myself." And so Diggy looks at her and he says, "Fine." And so all of the men back up. And then Rachel, in front of these 4 people who earlier that day she would have considered her friends, she began taking all of her clothes off. And then after she had removed all of her clothes and all of her jewelry, she left one ring on her hand, and she clutched it with her other hand, and she looked at Diggy and said, "Can I please just keep this one?" The ring she was holding on to was a ring that her good friend Corey Haynes had given her right before he was killed in that car accident. And Diggy just says, "No." And he reaches out and he literally pulls it off of her hand. And so standing there completely naked and alone and terrified, Rachel was then ordered by Diggy to start walking towards the grave. And so Rachel, with as much grace as she could muster, stood up straight, took a deep breath, and began walking. And then she finally reached the edge of the grave, at which point Diggy told her to walk down inside. And so Rachel very carefully turned around and lowered herself down into the grave. And then she stood up in the middle of the grave with her back to her attackers, at which point Diggy said, "Get on your knees." And so she did this, and as soon as she was down on her knees, she looked skyward and she pressed her hands together and put them right up against her chest, and she began praying. And as she's looking upward towards the sky, Diggy laughs at her and says, "Don't worry, you'll be up there soon." And then Diggy pulled his gun out, he aimed it at her back, and he began firing the gun. And he shot several times into the back of her head, into her back, and then his gun jammed, at which point he cleared the jam, he reloaded his gun, and then fired even more shots into her body. And then he put his gun away, and he, along with the other 3 men who had just witnessed this and participated in this, used their shovels to fill the hole back in, covering her up. Once she was buried, the men rounded up all of her things, along with the shovels and the murder weapon, and they chucked it into the nearby pond. Diggy made sure to crush the ring Rachel had said was so important to her before he threw it into the water. Then the men climbed back into the red Jeep, and they drove back to Everett. And on the ride, Diggy would tell them that if they told anyone about what they had just done, he would kill them too. But just a few days later, after Rachel had been reported missing, the mother of Jeffrey Barth. Jeffrey was someone who had been at Kevin Jihad's house on the night Rachel was abducted, and he also played a role in her capture. His mother, Jeffrey Barth's mother, behind his back, went to police and told them that she thought her son knew something about Rachel's disappearance. And so the police, they rushed to Jeffrey and they interviewed him, and he would quickly say, "Oh, I don't know anything, but you should talk to Matthew Durham." Matthew, if you remember, was the driver the night Rachel was killed. He also helped dig her grave and he witnessed her murder. And when police spoke to Matthew, at first he refused to speak and tried to act tough, but when the police ratcheted up the pressure, he cracked, and he told them everything, including where to find Rachel's body. And as soon as it became clear the police had Rachel's body, every other member of the Northwest Mafia who had been involved in Rachel's murder rushed to speak with the police because they were all trying to save themselves by blaming the other people in the group. And so that is why we have such a clear picture of exactly what happened to Rachel in her final moments, because those responsible told the police everything. During their trials, all 8 of the accused Northwest Mafia members were smug and did not take responsibility for their actions. But the worst of all of them by far was Diggy. During his trial, he smiled, and he even repeatedly turned around to look at Rachel's family so he could laugh at them and wink at them. Ultimately, all 8 of the accused were found guilty of various charges ranging from rendering criminal assistance all the way up to first-degree murder. 16-year-old Nathan Lovelace, whose home was supposed to be the site of the kidnapping, was sentenced to 116 days in jail. 20-year-old Tony Williams, who turned the volume of the music up to drown out Rachel's screams, and who also got the duct tape for Diggy when he was restraining Rachel in the garage, he received slightly more than 9 years in prison. 22-year-old Jeffrey Barth, who played a large role in subduing and kidnapping Rachel, and whose mother had gone to police and tipped them off about what had happened, he received 10 years in prison. 18-year-old Maurice Rivas, who was Rachel's closest friend in the group and who had pledged to support her and have her back as they got their lives together, he was sentenced to nearly 26 years in prison for assisting in Rachel's abduction and helping dig her grave. 17-year-old Matthew Durham, who drove the Jeep that carried Rachel to her death and who also helped dig Rachel's grave, he received 26 years in prison. 32-year-old Kevin Jihad, who was determined to have masterminded the finer details of the abduction and the murder, he was sentenced to nearly 37 years in prison. 22-year-old John Whitaker was sentenced to life in prison for being directly involved in the entire abduction and murder process. And 20-year-old John Diggy Anderson, the leader of the Northwest Mafia and Rachel's ex-boyfriend, he was also sentenced to life in prison for his role in her murder. Throughout Rachel's horrible ordeal, there were many people who could have stepped in and stopped what was happening to her, most notably Trissa Connor, who was Kevin Jihad's girlfriend and who found Rachel tied up in the garage, and Maurice Rivas, who was alone with Rachel in that cul-de-sac and could have easily freed her, but didn't. As a result of these heart-wrenching details, Rachel's family and their legal team worked very hard to pass a bill called SHB 1236. This bill makes it a criminal offense in America if you do not summon assistance for a person that has suffered substantial bodily harm. They are hoping this will save at least one person from suffering unnecessarily. Today, the Berkheimer family is still grieving the loss of their Rachel. However, her father, Bill, takes solace in a particular photograph the police showed him. After Rachel's gravesite was discovered and her body was removed from it, the police took a photo of the grave itself. And in this photo, you can see an imprint in the soil of Rachel's hands where she fell after she was shot. And it looks like her hands were pressed together near her chest, meaning she was likely praying in her final moments on Earth. And Bill likes to believe that means she was at peace when she finally died. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please offer to hang the 5-star review button's new 75-inch TV on their wall, but purposefully miss all of the studs. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on iTunes, Amazon, Spotify, and everywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on any major social media platform. My username on all of them is just Mr. Ballin, and yes, I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballin.com to have a look. That's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's story starts like many other true crime stories. However, this one comes with a very unexpected twist at the end, one that is exceptionally brutal and graphic. As such, Viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please deliver a box of Girl Scout cookies to the 5-star review button, but before you hand them over, eat them all and replace them with stale saltines. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Britney Norwood was born in 1982 in Federal Way, Washington, which is a small city located about 20 miles south of Seattle. Growing up, Britney's family never had much money. Her father, who was the primary breadwinner, ran a small upholstery shop in town, and while he worked tirelessly, he barely earned enough money to make ends meet. And considering how large Britney's family was, she was one of 9 siblings, the lack of financial resources at times made life very challenging. However, Britney's parents were not complainers, and they instilled in all of their children the importance of hard work regardless of circumstance. And clearly that message resonated with their children because by the time Britney was a teenager, her older siblings had already gone on to become doctors, engineers, and management consultants. As for Britney, she was just as ambitious as her older siblings, but her interests were in athletics. By the time she was in high school, she had become one of the very best soccer players in the entire state of Washington. She was so good, in fact, that by her senior year of high school in 2000, the best college soccer programs in America were actively recruiting her. She would finally settle on attending Stony Brook University in Long Island, New York, because they offered her a fantastic scholarship and they were known for their excellent soccer program. Britney was incredibly proud of her scholarship. It not only represented the hard work pays off motto that her parents had preached all of her life, but it also lifted a serious financial burden off of her parents. So in the fall of 2000, Britney left Washington State and headed east to New York to begin her collegiate career. But right away, she struggled. Britney had never left home before, and now she was suddenly 3,000 miles away from her family and her friends, and she missed them terribly. Within the first few days of being at her new school, she called her family and told them how much she missed them and how she kind of regretted coming to New York in the first place, but they reassured her that she had made the right choice, that these feelings were normal, and she just needed to give it some time. But despite taking her family's advice and sticking it out at Stony Brook, Britney never really felt like she belonged there. She made friends, she got good grades, and performed well on the soccer team, but with every passing semester, Britney became less and less connected to the school and the people there and just longed to be home. And so with that in mind, in 2003, so 3 years after she had arrived at Stony Brook, Britney was at her school feeling down about her situation when she had a serious lapse in judgment. Britney, who had never gotten in trouble in her life before, randomly stole one of her teammates' things out of their locker. She didn't even know why she did it. It just kind of happened, and then pretty much immediately she got caught. And as soon as she returned what she had taken. She felt horrible and she apologized, but the damage was done. The incident had already been reported to the school, and the school had a very strict code of conduct policy, which theft was in clear violation of. And so Britney had her scholarship revoked, and without it, her family could no longer afford the school, and so she had to come back home. And when she got home, she felt like she had let her entire family down. And so for the next several years, the shadow of this huge mistake loomed over her like a dark cloud. She just kind of kept her head down and took part-time work here and there, but for the most part, while she was home, she was just sad and directionless. But finally, in 2010, so 7 years after coming home from school, when Britney was now 28 years old, she decided enough was enough. She was going to stop letting this mistake define her life. She was going to go out and find a career and make something of her life, like her other siblings had. And the career move that seemed to make the most sense to her was becoming a personal trainer. Despite not playing soccer anymore, fitness was still a very big part of her life, and she loved the idea of helping other people get fit and stay fit. And so she began looking at where personal trainers were the most in demand, and she found Washington, D.C. was a total hotspot, and it just so happened 2 of her siblings were already living there. And so that year, she packed up her stuff and she headed out to D.C. as well. When she got there, she had a little cash, but not enough to sustain her longer than a month or 2, so she applied for and got a job with a Lululemon shop. Lululemon is a company that sells yoga athletic apparel. The shop was located in Bethesda, which is a very wealthy suburb of Washington, D.C., and right around the corner from the shop was a gym that Britney immediately fell in love with and decided would be the perfect gym for her to run her personal training practice out of once she got certified. So a very happy and rejuvenated Britney began work at the Lululemon shop in Bethesda in late 2010, fully expecting to only be there for a few months before she transitioned to her personal training career. At around the same time Britney began working at the store, another young woman had started working there as well. Her name was Jana Murray, and she was quite similar to Britney. She was 30, so 2 years older than Britney, and she had been raised in a close-knit, modest household in Texas where her parents had preached always working hard and doing the right thing, and she really took that to heart. And like Britney, Jana was also a star high school athlete, except instead of playing soccer, she was a big track and field star. And actually, she set some records in Texas for the discus throw. But after graduating high school, instead of pursuing athletics in college, Jana had pursued business. She enrolled in the business program at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. After she graduated, she worked in the private sector for a few years before deciding it made sense for her to go back to school to earn her master's degree in business. She was accepted to the very prestigious Johns Hopkins Business School, which was located a few miles from the Lululemon shop where Britney worked. And by 2010, Jana was in her final semester, and all she had left to complete was a final thesis paper. A thesis is a long essay involving personal research. The assignment was to write about the structure of a company of her choosing. And since Jana was a huge fan of Lululemon apparel, she had decided to write about them. And during her research on Lululemon, she discovered that the company was far more than just clothing. They had what seemed to be a really cool company culture. All employees, no matter how junior, were encouraged to pursue whatever goals they had, even if their goals meant leaving Lululemon at some point. It was like the company fundamentally cared more about their people than their product. And Jana loved that. And so as she's writing this paper, on a whim, she decides to go get a job at a Lululemon store. And the nearest location was the one near her school. Jana figured working at the shop would only make it easier to finish her thesis, since it would provide her boots-on-the-ground information. Also, she just wanted to see for herself if this company was as amazing as it seemed to be. And so her plan was just to work at this shop until her thesis was done, at which point she'd earn her master's and more than likely she would quit and move on with her life. So in late 2010, when Britney and Jana found themselves working at the same Lululemon shop in Bethesda, they were aware of each other, but really didn't know each other. Their only interactions were when their shifts happened to overlap, which did not happen very often. But when it did, they were perfectly nice to each other. They would chit-chat, but they were coworkers, not really friends. However, a terrifying event was about to link them together forever. On the evening of March 11th, 2011, Jana and Britney were working together at the Lululemon. It was an uneventful shift. They chatted, they helped customers, and in between all of that, they would knock out whatever closing duties they were responsible for so that when closing time came, they could leave quickly. And then when it was closing time at 8 p.m., the pair did one last sweep of the store to make sure everything was neat and put away and locked, and then they both grabbed their things and headed out the front door. Once they were outside, Jana turned around and she pulled the keys out of her pocket and she locked the front door. And then Jana hopped in her car and she drove off. And Britney, she turned and began walking down the sidewalk toward the metro train station. But after only a few minutes of walking, Britney swung her backpack off of her shoulder right in front of her, and she reached inside to fish around for her wallet because her metro train pass was inside of her wallet. And so she's fishing around her bag, she's still walking towards the train, and she can't find it. And so she comes to a full stop, she unzips her bag completely, and she looks inside, and her wallet is not in there. And as soon as she sees that it's missing, she remembers she left it on the break room table at the Lululemon store. And the only way she could go back and get her wallet was if Jana came back with the keys and unlocked the front door. And so Britney just stood there for a minute wondering what she should do. She kind of felt bad about calling Jana to drive back and open the store for her, but she really needed her wallet for a whole bunch of reasons. And so finally, she picks up her cell phone and she calls Jana. And when Jana picks up, Britney says, I'm really sorry, but I left my wallet in the store. Would you mind coming back and just opening the doors for me? I'll run in and I'll get it. Be super quick. And Jana, surprisingly, was totally fine with this. She actually laughed and said, I left my laptop in the break room and I was going to get it tomorrow, but this is an excuse to go back and get it now. And so Jana told Britney she would be back at the front of the store in just a couple of minutes. And so Britney thanked her, they hung up the phone, and then Britney turned and she began running back towards Lululemon. When Britney arrived at the front of the store, Jana was already there, and Britney immediately said, "I'm so sorry, thank you so much for coming back." And Jana said, "Really, it's no big deal." And then Jana pulled her key out and she opened the front door of the store and they stepped inside. The layout of the store was basically just a big square where the front door entered the square right in the middle of it. So you step inside, you're in this kind of main shopping area. It's just this one square. And then all the way at the back, kind of lined up with the front door, behind the cash registers, was this employee-only hallway that went straight back about 7 or 8 feet. And then it reached this T intersection where if you turned left, there would be another hallway that went straight for maybe 10 or 15 feet, and it would come to a dead end at a door, and that door would lead to a bathroom. And then if you were standing in front of that bathroom door and looked left, there would be another door that led into a very small kitchen. And then if you went back to the T intersection and turned right and looked straight ahead, you would see another stretch of hallway that was about 10 or 15 feet long, and it would look exactly like the left hallway, except at the end of the right hallway, there was no door to a bathroom. It was just kind of a dead end. But at the end of the right hallway, if you walked all the way down it and then turned right, you would see there was a door that led into the break room. So the break room and the kitchen were kind of oriented in the same position at either ends of each hallway. And so the two women go inside the store with Britney in the front. They get inside, Jana flips on the lights, and they walk across that square main shopping area. They go past the cash registers into that employee-only hallway. They go straight down, they turn right, they make their way down the right hallway, and then they open the door to the break room, and they go inside. Britney very quickly found her wallet. It was on the table. She grabbed it. And so after she had her wallet, she just left the break room and began walking back out towards the main shopping area and the front door. Jana was only a couple of seconds behind her. She grabbed her laptop and then she left the break room. She walked back down the hallway. And as she turned back into the main shopping area, she kind of had her head down. She was fiddling with her laptop and her phone. But even though she wasn't looking up, just looking down, she could tell right in front of her, Britney had come to a full stop in the middle of the main shopping area. And so as soon as she saw that, she stopped what she was doing and she looked up. And immediately she could see why Britney had come to a stop. There were now 2 men wearing all black with black ski masks on that were standing between them and the front door. The following morning, the Lululemon employee who was supposed to come in that morning and open the store and work that day, she turns onto the street that the shop is on and she begins walking towards the front door. It's a bright, beautiful, sunny morning. There are lots of people out going about their daily routines. And so this employee, she walks right up to the front door of the Lululemon. She's not really looking into the store. She's kind of got her head down and she fishes in her pocket. She pulls out her key that opens the front door. She slots it into the lock and she turns it to unlock it. And right away, she feels no resistance. The door was already unlocked. And so this really gets her attention and she looks up, but there's a glare on the glass from the sunlight, so she can't see inside. And so she just pulls the key out of the lock. And then she pushes open the door and she takes a very tentative step inside. And right away she sees the entire store is destroyed. There are shelves knocked over, there's clothing everywhere, it's a complete mess. And before she can even process what she's seeing, she hears what sounds like moaning coming from the back of the store, basically back in those hallways. And so this employee is terrified, and instead of going in to investigate, she just turns around and leaves the store and immediately calls 911. And as she's on the phone with police, this man who just happened to be walking by at this moment, he saw her and saw how visibly upset she was. And so he just stood next to her and waited for her to get off the phone with the police. And then when she was, he asked her, what's going on? And she would explain that the door was unlocked, the store is a complete disaster, and I heard moaning inside, and I'm too scared to go in. And so the man says, hey, I'm going to go in there and take a look around because I'm worried there could be someone who's hurt, who needs our help right now, before the police even get here. And so this man walks through the front door of the Lululemon, and right away, as soon as he steps in, he steps on broken glass, and he looks up, and the store is completely destroyed. Everything's knocked over, and he immediately hears the moaning coming from the back of the store. And so he very carefully starts walking straight ahead through the store, stepping over shelves that have been knocked down and trying hard not to destroy any merchandise that's on the ground. And when he reaches the back of the store, basically the entrance to this employee hallway that goes straight back, he hears the moaning, but he can't really tell which hallway it's coming from. And so he just calls out like, hey, who's back there? Do you need my help? But there was no reaction. And so he begins walking forward, and then he stops. He realizes the ground is slick. And so he looks down and he sees there's a very obvious blood trail from where he is standing straight back down this employee hallway. And the blood trail appears to turn right and kind of disappears out of sight down that right hallway. And so the man is terrified. He turns around and he looks towards the front of the store, kind of hoping that maybe the police or the paramedics would get there. But it's just the employee he had spoken to, and she looks terrified. And so the man decides, if there's someone hurt back here, I really need to go see what's wrong. And so very carefully, he begins walking down this initial hallway, following the blood trail. And then he turns right into that right hallway, and he looks, and he can't believe what he is seeing. It looks like the entire right stretch of hallway was covered in blood. I mean, the floors, the walls, the ceilings, everything. There is blood everywhere. However, there's no person. It looks like all this blood kind of turns right and goes into the door at the end of the right hallway, the break room. And so this man knows, okay, obviously someone is very badly hurt, and whoever is moaning is almost certainly in that break room. And so he calls out again to see if this person will call back to him, but it's silent. And so he walks down this right hallway that's soaked in blood, and he gets to the end, and he turns right, and he grabs the handle of the break room door. He turns the handle, and he pushes the door open. And at first, he couldn't quite open it. There was something blocking the door from opening. But finally, he kind of muscles it open enough that he can look inside, and he realizes what was blocking the door. There was a young woman lying face down on the ground, and her legs had been blocking the door. And this woman was Jana. And this man, who was not medically trained, immediately understood this woman is deceased. The injuries she has sustained are so bad, there is absolutely no way she is alive. And he immediately thought, she also has likely been dead for some time. This does not look like it just happened. And so he's thinking, who's moaning? Where's the moaning coming from? Is there somebody else in this room? And so he pushes and kind of moves her body out of the way and sticks his head into the break room, and he scans around, but there's no one else in there. But as he's looking around, he hears the moaning again, and he realizes it's coming from the other side of the hallway, at the end of the left hallway. And so he shuts the break room door, and he walks back up the hallway to the T intersection. And instead of turning and walking into the main shop, he continues down the left hallway. And he goes all the way down until he's standing in front of the door that leads into the bathroom, and to his left is the door that leads to that kitchen. And as he's standing there, he just kind of yells out, hey, whoever's in here, say something, because he doesn't know what door they're in. And he hears the moaning, and it's coming from the door right in front of him, the bathroom door. And so he opens the bathroom door, and immediately he's struck by all the blood all over the bathroom. And lying on her back on the ground is another young woman. It was Britney. Her hands were zip tied together and attached to a pipe on the side of the room, and she was covered in blood. There were obvious stab wounds and slash marks and bruises all over her. And at first, this man assumed she must be deceased, and there must be a third person in this bathroom who's doing the moaning. But then he was startled when Britney made this low, guttural moaning sound, almost like the sound of an animal dying. And he realized that was the moaning he was hearing. It was Britney. At that moment, the police had arrived. They had rushed inside. They grabbed this man and escorted him out. They secured the scene, and then the paramedics came in, and they would confirm that unfortunately Jana was deceased. And then when they went to Britney, they found that she was still clinging to life. And so they put her up onto a stretcher, and they began wheeling her out. And as she was being brought out of the store, the paramedics began trying to talk to her. And Britney, amazingly, was able to say a few words. The police, who are also on the scene, they see this, and they're concerned that, she might pass away from her injuries before they get to talk to her. And so sensing she was able to talk, they kind of rushed over as she's being loaded into the ambulance out front, and they would say, hey, do you remember anything about what happened to you and the other woman who was in there? And Britney was able to tell them that the night before there had been these two men who were wearing all black. They had ski masks on, so they didn't know what they looked like. And they had robbed the store, and then they had sexually assaulted both of the women. But Jana had apparently fought back so fiercely that they had killed her before they left. And so after she tells police this, the ambulance gets shut up and she's taken away to the hospital. And then the police immediately go into the Lululemon store to get the security footage from inside the shop to see if they can get some footage of the attack and see what happened. But unfortunately, the only camera this store had was on the exterior of the back of the building, just kind of looking out at a parking lot. There were no cameras looking in the store or at the front of the store. You have to remember, Bethesda, where the store was located, was considered to be extremely safe, very low crime neighborhood. And so more than likely, that was why this store did not have a security system. And so very frustrated, the police pulled up the only footage they could, which was this exterior camera. And sure enough, the night before, around midnight, the camera picked up two men wearing all black with their hoods up, running away from the store. And so there was really no way to identify who they were. All they could tell was, one was fairly tall. But nonetheless, they pulled the footage and they gave it to the media. And then that day and into the night, the local news played this footage on repeat, asking people in the area to come forward if they know who these two guys are. But by the next day, when the media and the police investigation had turned up nothing on these two guys, the police added a $150,000 reward for any information about who these two guys were. But after 48 hours since the discovery of this crime, still no one had come forward with any meaningful information about who these guys were, and so the police were kind of at a dead end. And so some of the detectives decided to go back to the Lululemon shop to walk the crime scene again to see if maybe something was missed in the initial search. And so the police, they come back to the shop, and it's being guarded 24/7 by police at this point. There's yellow crime scene tape outside blocking people off. And so the detectives arrive, they go underneath the yellow tape, they go past the security, they go inside, and then one of the detectives just walks straight to the back of the store and just kind of stands there near the registers looking around. And as he was looking around, he began looking at all of the bloody footprints that were on the ground. Now, by this point, all of the prints had been accounted for except for one set. There was a men's size 14 shoe print that had been spotted in several locations in the store, and it was just kind of assumed that it belonged to one of the killers. The thing about this print was that the treads of this shoe were fairly unique. They had a distinctive and fairly easy to recognize pattern to them. The police knew about this shoe print, but to be honest, they hadn't given it much thought because they felt like the print only seemed to confirm that a relatively tall man had been involved in this crime. But as this one detective stood in the back of the store and was just kind of looking around, he noticed a bin of shoes on the ground in the store. These shoes were there for shoppers to put them on when they were getting their pants hemmed and fitted to them. These shoes were not for sale. They were just kind of random shoes that were there effectively as props to make sure people's clothes fit properly. And the detective noticed one of the shoes at the top of the pile in this bin appeared to be a large men's shoe. And so purely out of curiosity, he reached down and he flipped the shoe over to look at the treads. And to his shock, they were an exact match to the unique treads on the size 14 bloody print. But the shoes he was holding were clean. There was no blood on them. So the detectives, they kind of all converge on the shoe, and they're thinking to themselves, did the attackers come in barefoot and perpetrate this attack with store shoes on and then afterwards clean them and leave them behind? Or is it just a crazy coincidence that one of the attackers happened to have the exact same style shoe and size as the one in this bin? They had no idea, but they felt like this was significant and they needed to get to the bottom of why this kind of random shoe in the store matched this print. And they thought the only person who might have more information about what the killer's shoes looked like would be Britney. And so at this point, Britney was still in very rough shape, but she had stabilized to the point where the police felt comfortable speaking to her. And so they paid her a visit and they asked her if she could remember anything about her attacker's feet. Did they wear shoes? And if so, what color were they? Anything she could remember at this point would be helpful. But Britney would say, no, I'm sorry, I don't remember their feet at all. But there was something about the way she just very quickly dismissed the shoes that tipped the police off that maybe Britney could be hiding something. But the police didn't press her because they knew she had just been in this horrific attack, and they also didn't really have a good sense of what her normal behavior looked like. So they just thanked her and they left. They were planning to speak to her again the following day, but she actually got in touch with them first and offered to have a meeting to go over what happened. And from the sound of her voice, it just sounded like she was just eager to help them. And so the police, they sat down with Britney again, and they began talking about what happened and kind of going over the details. And they asked her again about the shoes. And again, she said she just didn't know. And then at some point in this second discussion they're having, Britney kind of offhandedly mentioned something that she believes is just a small detail. But that small detail would ultimately be the thing that would lead police to figure out what actually happened on the night Jana was killed. This is what happened. Back on March 11th, 2011, so the night of the attack, Jana and Britney were working in the store. It was a normal shift. Everything was fine. And then at closing time, they did their duties. They walked outside. Jana locked the front door, and then they said their goodbyes and they went their separate ways. Jana drove off in her car and Britney began walking to the metro train station. But Britney realized she had left her wallet in the break room, and so she called Jana, and Jana would tell Britney that it was no big deal because she had left her laptop in the break room. Back at the front of the store, Jana double parked her car out on the street, and then she and Britney headed inside the shop. Britney would lead the way to the break room at the end of the hallway on the right, and after she got her wallet, Britney would turn around and leave the break room ahead of Jana to make her way back out to the main shopping area. And so Jana was only a few seconds behind Britney. She was just getting her laptop, and then when she had it, she left the break room, she walked down the hallway, and she turned and began walking into the main shopping area as well. And she had her head down. She was just kind of fiddling with her phone and her laptop. But at some point, she realized, even without looking up, that Britney had come to a full stop in the middle of the shopping area. So Jana looks up, and there were not two men wearing all black with black ski masks blocking their way to the front door. In fact, there were no men involved in what happened next at all. The two men that had been seen on the security camera in the back of the building were just two cooks who happened to be hustling by the night of the attack and who happened to be wearing all black. It was just a coincidence. But there was someone standing in the store blocking Jana from leaving. It was Britney. Britney was staring at Jana, and in her hand was a foot-long square metal rod. It was one of the pieces of metal that normally was anchored into the walls of the store to hold up merchandise. Jana is so caught off guard by this, she has no idea what the issue is. And so she says to Britney, hey, calm down, we can talk about this. But Britney was not trying to talk to Jana. Britney was trying to silence Jana, and she had lied about her wallet to lure Jana back to the store. This was a setup. Earlier that night, during their shift together, Jana had caught Britney stuffing a pair of yoga pants into her bag and had confronted her about it. And it's believed Britney was worried Jana was going to tell their boss about it the next day and that Britney would be fired because of it. And then once again, her life would be derailed and she would be humiliated, and Britney just couldn't have that. And so as Jana slowly began to back up into the hallway with her hands up, trying to calm Britney down, Britney began to advance on her. And as soon as she did, Jana screamed and turned and ran down that employee hallway. She turned right and bolted down the hallway towards the break room. She grabbed the break room door and she was trying to get it open, but before she could, Britney had caught up to her and she smashed her over the head with the pipe. Immediately, Jana turned around, she put her hands up over her head to protect herself, and she begged Britney not to hit her again. But Britney wasn't listening. Britney just wound up and smashed her across the arms with the pipe. Jana began screaming out and pleading with her to stop, but Britney just kept on going. And for the next several minutes, Jana just stood at the end of this hallway in front of the break room door, just trying desperately to protect herself with her hands. But Britney was so strong and fast, and she kept striking her on her head and on the sides and anywhere else she could land a blow. The blood spatter on the walls of the end of that right hallway would later reveal that Jana had gradually moved from a standing position down to the fetal position, meaning Britney had literally beat her until she collapsed on the ground. And when Jana hit the ground, she must have known she was trapped. There was no escape route for her, and she was so badly wounded that even if there was a way to go, Britney was going to catch up to her and Britney was going to stop her. And so Jana just began quietly begging for her life. But Britney had other plans for her. At the end of that right hallway that they were both in, Britney had noticed a red toolbox was on the ground in the corner. And so around the time Jana had fallen to the ground and was begging for her life, Britney dropped the metal pipe and she casually opened the toolbox, revealing screwdrivers, nails, wrenches, hammers, all sorts of tools. And one by one, Britney began reaching into this toolbox, taking out a tool, and then smashing, cutting, slashing, and beating Jana with it. It would take Britney roughly 10 minutes to cycle through every single tool in that toolbox. But shockingly, despite being dealt 330 significant wounds, Jana was still alive and she was still pleading for her life. Frustrated, Britney stood up, she chucked the tools on the ground, she turned around and she walked down the hallway all the way to the kitchen at the other end of that left hallway. She went inside and she grabbed a large knife. Then she marched back into the hallway. She went straight down all the way to Jana. Jana is still begging for her life, and Britney just reaches down. She grabs her hair with her left hand and pulls her head forward towards her. Then she takes the knife with her right hand. She raises it up and she brings it smashing down into the back of Jana's skull. The knife would pierce her skull, it would pierce her brain, and that would be the killing blow. Once Jana was deceased, Britney simply got to work, staging the store to look like a robbery gone wrong. The first thing she did was drag Jana's body out of the hallway and into the break room. And then once the door was shut, she headed out to the front of the store and just walked straight outside and climbed into Jana's car that was still double parked outside. And she drove that around the block to a parking lot. And then when she got back inside of the shop, she went to that bin of shoes used for fitting pants. And she took out the size 14 men's shoe, she put them on her feet, and then she began walking around in the pool of blood underneath Jana in the right hallway and began tracking the bloody prints all over the store to make it appear like a man was involved in the attack. And then after cleaning the shoes, she ransacked the store, and then she grabbed a knife and a screwdriver and she headed into the bathroom where she repeatedly stabbed and slashed herself before tying her hands and her feet with zip ties. At 8 a.m. the next morning, she was discovered. The seemingly small piece of information that Britney kind of accidentally gave to police during that second meeting, this piece of information that kind of broke the case, that came when the police asked her if she knew what kind of car Jana drove or if she'd ever been inside of Jana's car. And Britney would say, "No, I don't know what it looks like and I've never been inside of it." But a couple of days later, when Jana's car would be found and the police would search it, they would find Britney's hair and DNA all over it. So they knew Britney had been lying to them. And so this is what ultimately led to Britney's arrest, and she would later be convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please deliver a box of Girl Scout cookies to the 5-star review button. But before you hand them over, eat them all and replace them with stale saltines. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on Spotify, iTunes, Google, Amazon, and everywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning. But in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. If you want to get in touch with me, you can send me a message on any major social media platform. My username on all of them is just @MrBallin. And yes, I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballin.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. Until next time, see ya. Before I record any story for any platform, I always tell that story to my wife first. She's basically my gauge of whether the story makes sense, whether it's interesting, and most times her reaction is pretty neutral. But today's story, she said it was so unusual, she found herself on the edge of her seat, just wondering what the ending was going to be because she really couldn't guess it. And then at the end, when I revealed the ending, she says to me, "Wait, are you serious?" But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do. And we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please spend a considerable amount of time out in the freezing cold with no gloves on, then come back inside and warm your hands up by placing them directly on the 5-star review button's neck. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Alexandra Ignatovic, or Sandra for short, was born in 1967 in a quiet suburb of Vancouver, Canada. Her parents, who had immigrated to Canada from Yugoslavia, were both extremely hardworking people who also had big, warm personalities and great senses of humor. They would pass all 3 of those qualities on to their daughter, which in turn made her a very popular person from a young age. In addition to her attractive personality, Sandra was also considered very physically attractive, so much so that when she was a teenager, her friends began to encourage her to compete in beauty pageants. Sandra was always flattered by these remarks, but would laugh them off, saying she didn't belong in something like that. But in 1985, during Sandra's senior year of high school, she finally gave in to her friends' suggestions and entered a local beauty contest called the Miss Burnaby Pageant. And much to her shock, but not to her friends, she would win. And this win would automatically enter her into the huge Miss Canada beauty competition that year, though she would lose that one. However, Sandra was not remotely fazed by the loss. She actually thought it was pretty funny that she had gotten as far as she had. After high school, Sandra lived at home with her parents and attended a technical school to become a dental assistant. During this time, Sandra and her mom, Sedenka, who she was very close with, developed a hobby that they did together on the weekends. On nice days, they would find local open houses, and they would pretend to be in the market for buying a home, when in reality, they just wanted to walk around the property and fantasize about what it would be like to live there. In 1987, when Sandra was 21 years old and was now working full-time as a dental assistant but still living at home, she and her mother, like usual, went to an open house one weekend in their neighborhood, and once they arrived, it was very crowded, and so they made their way off to the side and just began chatting in their family's native tongue, Serbo-Croatian. And so as they're doing this, a woman they didn't recognize walks up to them. She was this short, older woman with rosy cheeks who was grinning ear to ear, and when she reached the mother and daughter, she very excitedly began speaking in Serbo-Croatian as well. She said her name was Jelka Pesek, and she couldn't help but overhear them speaking in her native tongue. Like Sandra's parents, Jelka had immigrated to Canada from Yugoslavia, and like Sandra and her mom, Jelka was at this open house pretending to be in the market for a home when really she was just fantasizing same as they were. So these commonalities they shared immediately put them all at ease, and before long, all 3 of them were chatting and laughing like they were old friends. Over the course of their 15 or so minute-long conversation, Jelka eventually asked Sandra pretty point blank if she was single or in a relationship. And Sandra, who was a little caught off guard by the abrupt question, said, "I'm single." At which point, Jelka lit up, and with a smile on her face, she said, "Well, I'd love for you to meet my son Joe. He's about your age and single too." Sandra smiled, but before she could respond, Jelka kind of waved her off like she knew she was being too pushy, and she just said, "Look, our family owns an automotive shop in town. It's called Sam & Sons. If either of you ever have car troubles, it's on the house. Bring your car in. And if you, Sandra, swing by, I'll introduce you to Joe." Then she handed Sandra a business card and said her goodbyes to both of them and then turned and walked away. Once she was gone, Sandra and her mother kind of chuckled about the conversation they had just had, and then they went back to just enjoying the open house. And by that evening, when the mother and daughter had gotten back to their own home, they had more or less forgotten about Jelka. However, the following day, while Sandra was out running some errands, her car's engine started making really loud knocking sounds. While she didn't know what they meant, she knew that she really needed to have someone look at her car, and so as she began to look around, wondering if an auto body shop just happened to be close to her, she remembered Jelka from the day before giving her that business card for her auto body shop, and so Sandra pulled over to the side of the road, she fished inside of her purse, and she pulled out that card, the business card, and she saw the address of the auto body shop was only a couple of blocks away, and so she merged back onto the road and she began driving over. When she arrived outside of Sam & Sons Auto Body Shop, she parked in their front lot, and then she got out and she made her way into the front office, and then as soon as she stepped inside, she saw right ahead of her was this big desk, and behind the desk was Jelka. And as soon as Jelka saw Sandra coming in, Jelka lit up and she said, "Oh my goodness, you're here. Come here, come here. I got to introduce you to my son." And that's when Sandra said, "Well, actually, I'm here because my car actually broke down today. And I was wondering if, you could have a look at it." And immediately Jelka said, "Oh, of course." She grabbed a mechanic. She pulled him over and said, "Right now, go out and get Sandra's car. She has to be at the front of the line." And so the mechanic went out to get Sandra's car. And then Sandra said, "Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm going to just go step outside and just let me know when it's done." But Jelka would say, "No, no, 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 no. You have to meet my son. Hold on just a minute." And so Sandra just kind of stood in the waiting room, kind of feeling a little bit awkward. And Jelka ran back into the back room behind the desk. And then she came running back out a few minutes later. And just a few seconds behind her was this handsome man in a crisp suit who had short dark hair and a perfectly manicured mustache. And Jelka immediately grabbed him and kind of wheeled him out from behind the desk and brought him right in front of Sandra. And with a huge grin on her face, she says to Sandra, "This is Joe. This is my son. He's single. You're single. You two should go on a date." And so Sandra and Joe immediately laughed because it was so pushy and so forward, it was just kind of comical. But over the course of their very short interaction, they both found each other attractive and they actually agreed to meet up for a date. And over the course of the next few weeks, the pair would go on many dates and they would become inseparable. Joe would take Sandra to the nicest restaurants in town, they would go dancing, and then sometimes they'd just hop on Joe's motorcycle and go for long rides in the countryside. Less than a month after their first meeting, Sandra was already telling her family and friends that Joe might be the one. And she would be right, because almost exactly a month after their first meeting, Joe would ask Sandra to marry him, and she would say yes. Sandra was beyond excited. She knew this proposal had been abrupt, but she didn't care. She felt like Joe was perfect. However, there was one detail about Joe that Sandra hadn't really seen fully yet, and that was his mother. Sandra was aware that Jelka could be a bit pushy. After all, she did literally tell Sandra to date her son while they stood directly in front of her son. However, after that interaction, Sandra had really not spent much time around Jelka and so hadn't formed much of an opinion of her. But as soon as wedding preparations began, that would change. Jelka wanted to plan every single detail of the wedding. You should get married in this church. You should buy this gown from the store. Your bridesmaids should wear these dresses. Here's a great music list for the wedding reception. Although she presented these as suggestions, they were more like demands. At first, Sandra tried to just roll with it and allowed Jelka to have her way with a number of the decisions, but after each concession, it just seemed like Jelka would come back with even more demands. Finally, Sandra had just had enough, and she told Jelka, "You gotta stop inserting yourself into every single wedding planning decision. This is my wedding. This is Joe's wedding, not yours." And shockingly, Jelka responded by effectively saying, "I know better than you, and I'm not going to stop telling you how to have the best wedding because I want it to be the best." Sandra was dumbfounded. She felt like she literally could not stop Jelka, and so she went to her fiancé, and although she knew she was putting him in a really awkward situation, she told him he had to step in and tell his mom to back down, that she was totally overbearing and making this wedding process a nightmare. At first, Joe tried to act like Sandra was overreacting, but Sandra just was not having it, and she basically said, "I will postpone this wedding if you don't handle this." And so after a deep sigh, Joe told Sandra, "Okay, I'll go talk to my mom." And sure enough, Joe would. And Jelka would step back as a result of this conversation. However, it was plainly obvious that Jelka was not happy about this. And to show her displeasure, for the rest of the wedding planning cycle, Jelka refused to look at or talk to Sandra. But as upsetting as this was for Sandra, ultimately she was kind of okay with it because one, Joe had demonstrated that he could have her back when she really needed him, and two, she didn't really like talking to Jelka at this point. She found her incredibly annoying, and so to have Jelka ignoring her was kind of a good deal. A few weeks before their wedding, Sandra and Joe, who at that point both still lived with their parents, decided to go out and get an apartment they could share together as a couple. And they found one. It was very small and was the only one they could actually afford, but it was relatively close to both of their families and their work, so they took it. After getting the keys, Sandra and her mom would spend a very fun weekend going out to yard sales and discount stores to decorate and furnish the apartment, and by the time they were done, Sandra and Joe loved it. On June 11th, 1988, Sandra and Joe finally got married in front of all of their friends and family, and everyone seemed to have a great time, except for Jelka. Then, after the wedding, the new couple headed off to Hawaii for their honeymoon. A week later, Sandra and Joe returned to Vancouver, and when they walked into their new apartment, they were both shocked. The entire place had been completely redecorated. Couch covers had been switched out, the kitchen had been reorganized, bathrooms had different colored towels, the bed had different sheets on it, and it was even facing a different direction. After calling around to their families, they quickly discovered Jelka was responsible. She had used Joe's keys to slip into the apartment while they were on vacation. Sandra was furious. She and her mother had worked so hard to furnish and decorate the apartment to make it feel like her own, and now it just felt like Jelka's. It was so rude what she had done. Sandra literally couldn't believe it. Despite putting everything back the way it had been in their apartment, this was a massive violation of their privacy, and Sandra openly told Joe that she wanted nothing to do with his mother. However, it wasn't that simple for Joe. Despite her transgressions, Joe still loved his mom, and he got his paycheck from his mom. She was literally his boss at the auto body shop, so he couldn't just disown her, nor did he want to. This caused a lot of friction between the couple, but ultimately they just kind of accepted that they would need to find a way to live with Jelka and her intrusive behavior because she wasn't going anywhere. But despite Sandra's best efforts to put up with Jelka, Jelka made that nearly impossible on a regular basis. Shortly after the apartment redecorating incident, where afterwards Joe and Sandra told Jelka, "You cannot sneak into our apartment when we are gone," Jelka began sneaking into the couple's apartment when they were gone. Jelka had made a copy of her son's keys and just came and went as she pleased. At first, all she did was straighten things up around the apartment and periodically would go through their fridge, throwing away old food and sometimes replacing certain food items with other food items that she believed were better in some way. At first, Joe and Sandra actually didn't notice, but when it seemed like their entire fridge was starting to become full of food neither of them remembered purchasing, they confronted Jelka, and sure enough, she admitted to it. But the way she framed it was that she was simply swinging by and dropping off groceries. After this admission, privately, Sandra told Joe that he had to step in and stop Jelka from doing this. They had already told her, "You can't do this," and she's doing it all over again. And Joe, he would tell his wife, "Oh yeah, I'm going to tell her to stop, for sure." He actually would not. And so Jelka would just continue to come in and out of their apartment as she pleased. Sandra was furious and felt like she had totally lost control of the situation, but at the same time, she started having feelings that, maybe she was overreacting. Maybe she was wrong about Jelka, and she was just hypersensitive to what she was doing, and that in reality, Jelka was being really helpful. But when Jelka, during one of her secret apartment visits, removed half of Sandra's entire wardrobe from her closet and replaced it with clothing Jelka had bought, Sandra officially had had enough. Instead of waiting for Joe to come home that evening and to figure out what to do together, Sandra just hopped in her car and drove right over to her in-laws' house. When she arrived, she ran up the front steps. She didn't even knock on their door. She simply opened it and screamed at Jelka, who was straight ahead in the kitchen, that she can never come in their apartment without permission ever again. Then she screamed at Jelka to give her her clothing back immediately. Jelka seemed totally unfazed by this, and instead of saying sorry or trying to make an excuse, she just said very matter-of-factly, "You don't look good in your clothing. I know what you look good in." Then she walked over to a closet near the front door, pulled out several dresses and blouses and kind of chucked them at Sandra, and then holding her crumpled clothes in her arms, Sandra glared at Jelka for an extra second before turning and storming out of the house back to her car. When she got back to her apartment, Joe had come home at this point, so Sandra walked in and pretty much immediately laid into him. She explained how his mom had taken her clothes and that now she had just completely had it. She was done with Jelka. She can't come back in here. It's over. It's done. But while the couple fought, there was a knock on their front door. The couple stopped talking, and Joe stood up and walked over to the door, and he opened it. And shockingly, standing on the other side was Jelka and her husband, Sam. Sandra saw them and literally ran over and slammed the door in their face, but through the now shut door, she heard Jelka call out, "Please let us in. I have something very important I want to tell you." Sandra could sense that Jelka's tone seemed different somehow. Perhaps she was here to apologize. It certainly seemed possible given recent events. And so while holding the doorknob, Sandra turned and looked at Joe, who had a look of I don't know what to do on his face. And then with a very frustrated sigh, Sandra turned the doorknob and opened the front door again. And immediately, Jelka smiled at the couple and walked in like she owned the place. Sam followed behind her, but seemed wholly uninvested in whatever it was they were there for. Jelka strode right into the kitchen and she took a seat at the head of the table and then beckoned Sandra and Joe to come over and sit down as well. Sandra was already regretting her decision to let them in, but she did want to hear what Jelka had to say, and so she walked over and sat down, as did Joe. Once everyone was sitting around the table, Jelka smiled and said, Sandra, Joe, we're going to make an $85,000 down payment on this beautiful 2-story house for you two to live in. We know this apartment is small and you want to start a family, and we want to give you the best home to do that in. Sandra and Joe were dumbstruck. They made very little money and had almost no savings, and so home ownership was not exactly on the horizon for them, although it was something they often fantasized about. But now, this fantasy could become a reality if they just said yes to Jelka. And so with Jelka sitting there staring at them intently with a big grin on her face, eagerly awaiting their answer, the couple exchanged a few quick glances at each other, kind of feeling each other out, and then they said, okay, yeah, thank you so much. Jelka was extremely pleased. She hugged them both and asked them to come by the property the next day to have a look around, and then Jelka and Sam got up and they left. That night, Sandra and Joe lay awake in bed talking about this incredible thing that had happened, and they came to the conclusion that Jelka must have been trying to make some sort of peace offering, that this was effectively a way for her to say sorry for what had transpired between them. And so by the time Sandra fell asleep that night, she was feeling very optimistic that her relationship with Jelka was about to improve. The following day, Sandra and Joe drove over to the house that they had just agreed to let Jelka and Sam put the down payment on, and right away, what stood out to Sandra was the home's proximity to Jelka's house. It was only about 5 minutes drive away, much closer than their current apartment was to Jelka's house. Also, as soon as Jelka arrived in her car and got out to talk to them on the sidewalk, she was absolutely brimming with excitement, talking about how she couldn't wait to start decorating the inside of the house. It was like she was moving into the house. Alarm bells were going off in Sandra's head. This arrangement clearly was a mistake. But at the same time, Sandra felt like they were in too deep. They had already agreed to do this. How could they possibly back out now? So against her better judgment, a few weeks later, the sale of this new house was finalized and Sandra and Joe moved in. But within a week of living there, everything fell apart. Sandra had mentioned to Joe that she wanted to put in a simple red accent tile along the back of the kitchen wall. Joe had apparently relayed this information to his mother, who promptly arrived at the house specifically to tell Sandra she wasn't allowed to do that Jelka already had plans for the kitchen. A massive fight broke out between the two women that ended with Sandra saying, you know what, I'm done. I'm leaving, I'm moving in with my mom. Then Sandra did just that. She grabbed her things, put them in the car, and she left. Joe, who by now seemed to have just given up trying to keep the peace between his wife and his mother, didn't even try to stop her. It looked like Joe and Sandra's marriage was destined to fail. Jelka was just too much to overcome. But only a week after moving back in with her mother, Sandra started to feel nauseous. She took a pregnancy test and it revealed that she was pregnant. She was going to have Joe's baby. Sandra had a decision to make: return to Joe and by extension return to Jelka, or raise the child on her own. She called Joe to break the pregnancy news and talk about the way ahead for them, and he was extremely excited and begged her to come back and live in the house together again, and he promised he would keep his mother under control. By the end of the call, Sandra decided she was willing to go back and give it another shot, not because Joe was so convincing or that she thought Jelka was really going to change, but because she felt like she owed it to her unborn child. And much to Sandra's surprise, once she moved back into the house with Joe, it actually was much better than before. Namely because Jelka actually seemed to be giving them space. Clearly, Joe had laid down the law with her, and Jelka was respecting it. She gave them so much space that by the time Sandra actually gave birth to her son Brandon, she found herself secretly starting to kind of like Jelka, just a little bit. 6 months after Brandon was born, Sandra and Joe were both starting to feel very run down from being on baby duty 24/7. And so Joe suggested they go out on a date night that Friday. Sandra loved the idea and asked Joe to get them a babysitter, and then once he said he had, they made reservations for their favorite restaurant. When Friday came around, as Sandra was getting ready for the night, they heard the babysitter knock on the front door. Sandra opened the door and saw Jelka. Despite her recent good behavior, Sandra was still very much on edge, wondering when the old Jelka was going to come back out again. And so her immediate reaction to seeing Jelka on the other side of this door was, "What are you doing here?" Jelka looked at her funny and said, "I'm your babysitter. Joe asked me." Sandra immediately whipped her head around and looked at Joe, who was now standing very sheepishly in the middle of the room. Before Sandra could say anything to him, Jelka had slipped past her into the house and was already talking about how she and Brandon were going to have such a wonderful night together and that everything was going to be just fine. Sandra shut the door and then grabbed Joe and pulled him into another room and told him she didn't like this, that he should have told her he was going to have her babysit their son. But Joe told her she was overreacting, that, despite their past issues, his mom was really excellent with kids. This would be fine. Sandra did not like this, but eventually conceded. And then before the couple left, Sandra gave Jelka very specific instructions for how to care for Brandon, what to feed him, what time to put him to bed, etc. And the whole time, Jelka just reassured Sandra that it was going to be just fine. Just go out and have fun. Finally, after giving all the instructions she could possibly think of, Sandra and Joe said goodbye and they left. They went out to their favorite restaurant, and then afterwards they went to a club to go dancing. And as soon as they got there, Sandra stepped away and hopped on a payphone to call Jelka to make sure everything was going okay with their son. And when Jelka picked up, she informed Sandra that the boy was, quote, out like a light, because apparently she had given him some tea from the old country. Sandra said, "What? I told you he only takes breast milk. What did you give him?" And Jelka just laughed and said, "Don't worry about it. It's fine. He's asleep. Go enjoy yourself." Sandra was horrified. She hung up on Jelka and ran back into the club. She grabbed Joe and said, "Your mom just fed something to Brandon that she shouldn't have. We have to go." The two ran from the club. They hopped in the car, and then Sandra flew back to their house. As soon as they were parked outside, she ran up the steps into the house, right past Jelka, into her son's nursery, and then standing next to his crib, she reached down and she lifted him up, which should have woken him up, but it didn't. He just lay limp in her arms. And so immediately Sandra pressed his mouth up against her ear to see if he was still breathing, and barely she could tell he was still breathing. But despite screaming his name and moving him around, nothing was waking him up. And so by this point, Jelka had come into the room and she was trying to convince Sandra that this was no big deal, that, the tea from the old country works great. You got nothing to worry about. But at this point, Sandra is panicking and she's screaming at Jelka to tell her what was in the tea you gave him. But Jelka just wouldn't give her an answer. She just kept laughing and saying it was fine. And so finally, Sandra just takes her son and runs past Jelka, runs past Joe. She runs out to the car. She strapped her little boy into his car seat, and then she flew to the emergency room. And then when she got there, she hopped out. She's carrying her baby. She's hysterically crying. And she runs in through the doors, and all the doctors and nurses, they run over and they take the child from her, and they're asking all these questions. They're trying to figure out what's going on, and they start feeling for a pulse. And they would find one. However, it was very, very slow. And so they whisked Brandon away into an exam room to work on him and figure out what was going on. Meanwhile, Sandra just had to pace in the waiting room, crying hysterically, having no idea what's happening to her boy. But luckily, just a few minutes later, one of the doctors would come back out of the exam room and they would tell Sandra that, we think your son's going to be just fine. We don't know what he consumed, but whatever it was not good, and he should never have that again. And then he told Sandra she could come back and actually be with her son again. And so Sandra left the waiting room and she went down the hall. She went into the room where her son was. And there, laying on this bed with wires and tubes connected to him, is her little boy, who still looks totally lifeless. And so Sandra walked around and she sat down next to the bed and she laid her head down on the pillow and just looked at her son. And right there, in that moment, she decided that she was officially done with Jelka, even if it meant being done with Joe. A few minutes later, when Joe arrived by himself, Sandra would tell him he needed to choose. It was either going to be her or his mother. Unlike other times, Joe was not quick to come to his wife's side. In his mind, Sandra had become as much to blame for the drama as his mother was. And so after getting very frustrated with Sandra, He said, "You know what? You keep yelling at my mom and I don't like it. She only wants to help and be supportive and you just can't accept that. So I'm sorry, but I'm choosing my mom, not you." And Sandra would say, "Fine." And then the two of them just sat in silence on opposite sides of their son for the next hour until the doctors came back in and gave them the okay to take their son home, at which point Sandra immediately stood up and grabbed Brandon, and she and her son left the hospital without another word to Joe. She would drive her son to her mother's house and drop him off with her parents, and then she would go back to Joe's house, collect most of her things, and then move into her mom's house with her son. The following day, she would file for divorce. Immediately, the divorce became very nasty. Sandra didn't want Brandon anywhere near Jelka, so she decided to seek full custody of him. However, Joe, who by this point had gone from being something of an innocent bystander caught in the middle of two people he loved, to being aggressively on his mother's side, and therefore aggressively opposed to Sandra, told Sandra that he would be seeking full custody of Brandon as well. While these legal proceedings were going on, Joe's parents took it upon themselves to change all the locks of the house, knowing some of Sandra's things were still tucked away in the attic. Jelka also had their lawyer send Sandra a letter explaining that she was now forbidden from stepping foot inside of that house without express permission from Jelka. But as Joe and his mother made these punitive moves, Sandra would receive a huge legal break. The judge in their case had come to a decision. Sandra would get full custody of Brandon, and Joe would be required to pay child support and an alimony payment. The judge also ruled that Sandra would get primary ownership status of the house that Jelka had put the down payment on, and on top of all of that, based on Jelka's previous behavior, she was forbidden from having any contact with both Sandra and Brandon. Joe and his family were beyond outraged. But their only recourse was to be on their best behavior and try to file an appeal and have the judge change the ruling. So in the meantime, Joe very reluctantly and bitterly moved out of the house, and then Sandra and Brandon moved back in. Over the following few months, Joe didn't pay a dime of child support or alimony payments to Sandra. He also didn't bother to try to get in touch about seeing his son. Sandra was very upset about this. However, she was mostly just upset for her son, whose father basically had abandoned him. But as the silence between them grew, Sandra started to think to herself that maybe it was for the best. Fast forward about a year and a half to the summer of 1992, Joe was still not paying any support money to Sandra, and he and Sandra were still not talking, minus during court appearances for the appeals that had been filed. And during those short interactions, Joe would be openly cold and hateful toward his ex-wife, which Sandra could clearly tell made Jelka very happy. But Sandra didn't care. She had her son, she had the house, and she felt like no matter what they said or they did, they weren't going to stop her from trying to have the best life she could have. But Sandra's life was about to take a drastic and unexpected turn. In June of that year, Sandra walked out to her mailbox in the morning and found a small package with no return address on it. She brought the package inside, opened it up, and saw that it contained a paperback novel called The Deaths of Cindy James. It was a non-fiction account of a woman named Cindy James, who for years had been harassed by some unknown person who ultimately killed her and got away with it. Sandra's first thought when she saw this book was that, maybe she had accidentally signed up for a book club or something. And so she just put the book on the table and went about her day. That evening, after work, she saw the book on the table and just picked it up and sat down and began flipping through the pages for the first time. And right away, she noticed someone had underlined several passages in the book. When Sandra began reading these highlighted sections in the book, she started to feel very uncomfortable. All the highlighted sections were descriptions of the specific awful things that had happened to Cindy. Namely, her tree in her front yard had been lit on fire. She started getting threatening phone calls at all hours of the night. Strangers would lurk on her property. Cars followed her around when she was out in town. And then the last underlined passage was about Cindy's death, and only 2 words were underlined: "You're dead." Sandra didn't know what to make of this book, but it definitely felt threatening. She assumed Joe had sent it just to be cruel. 2 days later, Sandra was sitting in her living room with a friend when they both suddenly heard a strange sound coming from the outside of the front of her house. All of the windows that looked into the front yard had the curtains drawn, And so Sandra and her friend stood up and walked over and pulled one of the curtains aside. And right in the middle of the front of her property on her front lawn, her tree was on fire, just like the Cindy James book. In fact, as soon as Sandra saw this, she handed Brandon to her friend and she ran into the kitchen and she grabbed the book, the Cindy James book, and she ran back and she flipped through the pages and she found the passage about the tree and she showed it to her friend and she said, "Look, someone sent me this 2 days ago and now they're doing what's happening in the book to me." Sandra would call the fire department and the police department and they would all show up and they would put the fire out. And then afterwards, Sandra would speak to the officers and she would explain the situation about her divorce and how she'd received this book, but the police didn't have much they could do. Even if Joe had done this, there was no proof. So they just told her to, be vigilant and report anything strange you see, and if you call us, we'll come out immediately. Over the following weeks, a man started calling Sandra's house in the middle of the night. He never said anything, he just breathed into the phone. The calls became so frequent that Sandra had to disconnect her phone at night just so she and Brandon could sleep. She would tell the police about the calls, but again, there was just nothing they could do. About a month after the calls had begun, Sandra was giving her son a bath in their house, and after he was all clean, she scooped him up in a towel and she carried him across the hall into his room, which was on the first floor in the back of the house. And when she walked into his room, the light was off, so it's totally dark, and the curtains that cover the back window were actually pulled to the side, revealing a clear view into the backyard. And standing right on the outside of her house, looking into her son's window, is this large man with a ski mask on. And he can clearly see that Sandra is looking at him, but he's totally unfazed. In fact, when he can tell that Sandra has made eye contact with him, he leans forward into the glass before turning and walking out of sight. Sandra immediately runs all over her house, making sure all the doors are locked, and then as she's reconnecting her phone to call 911, she hears banging on windows and she hears banging on the walls, and then by the time the police show up, there's no sign that anybody was there. And so once again, the police had to say to her, "Sorry, you're on your own." The next day, when Sandra noticed a car was now clearly following her in town, she realized all of the underlined sections of the Cindy James book had now happened to her in real life, except for one, the last underlined section, the one where Cindy dies. Scared for her life, Sandra hired a private investigator to both watch her home and try to figure out who was behind this, but after a couple of weeks, the nightly calls and occasional footsteps outside of her windows at night continued, and the private detective had gotten no closer to figuring out who was behind this. However, he did tell Sandra that he had been following Joe around and watching him and his family, and they all appeared to just be living a normal life. On the afternoon of August 5th of that year, so 2 months after receiving the Cindy James book in the mail, Sandra walked out of her dental office with her coworker Bernice. That day, Sandra was supposed to give Bernice a ride home. So the pair walked across the parking lot to the road where Sandra's car was parked. Sandra hopped in the driver's seat and fired up the engine, while Bernice hopped in the passenger seat and bent down to shove her bag underneath the seat below her. As Bernice was bent down, she suddenly heard gunfire on her left. She screamed and stayed bent forward, gripping the back of her head to protect herself, and then when the shooting stopped, Bernice sat up and looked out the front window and she saw a red car speeding away from them. Then she turned to look at Sandra and she saw her coworker was slumped forward. 2 of the 6 shots that had been fired from that red car had struck Sandra in the head. Bernice ran out of the car and she got help, and before long the police and paramedics were there, but by the time they reached Sandra, it was too late. She was already deceased. After her death, the police immediately turned their attention to Joe as their primary suspect. However, despite showing no emotion when he was told the mother of his child had just been murdered, he did have a rock-solid alibi. He had been at a public swimming pool during the shooting and even had a receipt to prove it. But the police just weren't buying it. Something seemed off about him. So they began staking out Joe's parents' house, which is where he was living at the time, watching to see what Joe did and who he talked to. And for the first 4 days, nothing unusual happened. But on the 5th day, the police were watching the house from a distance when Yelka suddenly came out the front door and hopped in her car and started to back down her driveway, But before she reached the end of the driveway, she came to a stop. Then a man came running out of her house who was neither Joe nor her husband, and he climbed into the back seat of her car and then laid down on the floorboards so no one could see him. The police thought this was very odd, so they decided to trail Yelka. They would follow her to a nearby mall parking garage where she and this man would climb out of the vehicle and go into the mall at different times as if they were trying to make it seem like they didn't know each other. One of the officers would stay in the parking garage watching Yelka's car, while the other officer went into the mall to see what these two were up to. But very quickly, that officer lost sight of both Yelka and this man, and so he had to return back to the parking garage with his partner. A little while later, the two officers watched as Yelka returned to her car, and then a few moments later, so too did this man, who promptly climbed back into her car and got down on the floorboards out of sight again. The police would trail Yelka back to her house, where as soon as she parked in the driveway, the man in the back climbed out and walked to the front of the property, hopped in a parked car, and drove off. The police followed this man and pulled him over less than a mile away, and when he got out of the car, something fell out of his pocket that blew the case wide open. It would turn out Joe really hadn't been involved in what happened to Sandra. However, his mother Yelka had. She had grown to hate Sandra so much she had decided she wanted to get rid of her, and she had just the plan in mind. Yelka was obsessed with the story of Cindy James, and so she decided she would force Sandra to relive Cindy's nightmare all the way to its grisly conclusion. After doing some digging, Yelka discovered one of her family friends, a man named Milan Nanatic, had connections to a hitman named David Segoviano. David was really just a seedy criminal willing to do just about anything for money. Yelka instantly told Milan to hire David to take out Sandra. However, she stressed that David had to first carry out all the underlined segments of the Cindy James book before he shot her down. Because Yelka didn't just want to kill Sandra, she wanted to torture her first. Milan Nanatic was the man who was hiding in Yelka's car. The two had driven to that mall so that Yelka could take $30,000 in cash out of a bank that she was paying to Milan for organizing the hit. And then Milan was going to take a portion of that and pay it to David, the shooter. And so when Milan got pulled over by police, when he stood up, the cash that he had been paid by Yelka was jammed in his pockets. And so literally he stood up and hundreds of dollars began falling out of his pockets. And very quickly the police were able to figure out what it was for. Less than a year later, Yelka, Milan, and David were tried and convicted for the murder of Sandra Bajc. They were all given the maximum sentence for first-degree murder in Canada, which is 25 years. Joe Bajc was never charged with a crime. As for Sandra's son, he would go on to be raised by Sandra's mother. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, and you haven't done this already, please spend a considerable amount of time out in the freezing cold with no gloves on, then come back inside and warm your hands by placing them directly on the 5-star review button's neck. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and everywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username for all platforms is just Mr. Ballin, and yes, I really do read most of my direct messages. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballin.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time. See ya. We've all heard about scorned ex-lovers lashing out at their former partners when the relationship comes to an end, but it's unlikely you've ever heard of what happens between the lovers in today's story. It is quite possibly the most unlikely outcome of a failed relationship ever. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do. And we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please convince the 5-star review button to get a very large, intricate tattoo that they were on the fence about getting. And then once they follow through and get it, shrug your shoulders and tell them, I don't like it very much. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Michelle Hadley was born in 1985 in Ontario, California, a city located 40 miles east of Los Angeles. Her parents, who owned a small manufacturing business in town, never had a ton of money, but they always had enough to make ends meet. Growing up, Michelle's parents taught her and her younger sister to always put their all into whatever it was they were involved in, whether it was academics, athletics, or relationships. They also taught their daughters to always take their Christianity very seriously. By the time Michelle was in high school, she had made her parents very proud, becoming one of the top students in her class, and also becoming a very talented cross-country runner. But despite these early successes, Michelle never bragged about them. Not because she was trying to stay humble necessarily, but because that was just her personality. She was a very private person who did not seek the spotlight. After high school, Michelle attended Dickinson College in Pennsylvania on a scholarship, and then after graduation, when Michelle was just 22 years old, she married her high school sweetheart. However, that relationship would not last. When they divorced just 4 years later, Michelle was upset about it, but she was confident that she was going to be okay. She was still very young, she had the full support of her family, and she had a good job that allowed her to be self-sufficient. All she needed to do was to be patient and wait for the right partner to come along. And in 2013, roughly a year after her divorce, it seemed like the right partner had. In August of that year, Michelle connected with a U.S. Marshal named Ian Diaz on a dating website. The U.S. Marshal Service is the federal government's primary agency for fugitive investigations. Shortly after Michelle and Ian connected online, they met in person for the first time over a cup of coffee. At 35, Ian was 9 years older than Michelle. He was tall and fit. Michelle was slender with dark hair and deep brown eyes. They both had great smiles, and right away they hit it off. That first cup of coffee was quickly followed by text messages, phone calls, and arrangements to meet again. On just their second date, Ian blurted out, "I love you," to Michelle. This definitely caught Michelle by surprise, but she was thrilled. As a child, she sometimes fantasized about being a princess and having her Prince Charming come along and whisk her away. And suddenly it seemed like that actually was happening. Over the next several months, the pair would continue to see each other on a near-daily basis, and then in the spring of 2014, they moved in together, and then in December of 2014, Ian took Michelle on a trip to New York City where he asked for her hand in marriage, and she would say yes. Michelle was on cloud nine. Ian really was her Prince Charming. Once they were engaged, Michelle threw herself into planning their perfect future together as Mr. and Mrs. Diaz. However, cracks began to appear in their relationship. Michelle would later say that Ian had pressured her to take a $20,000 pay cut to leave her job that she loved and take a marketing position at a place he loved and had once worked himself, Disneyland Resort in Anaheim, California. She also said that Ian began asking her to wear more revealing, sexier clothes, and he wanted her to get acrylic nails and get her belly button pierced. It wasn't Michelle's style, but since she didn't want to disappoint her future husband, she would, from time to time, put on the crop tops and short skirts just to make him happy. But despite doing that, Ian never really did seem happy, and eventually he would open up to her about some of his deeper sexual fantasies. He told Michelle that what he really wanted to see was her having sex with other men. At first, Michelle was stunned and said, "No, absolutely not." But despite her refusal, Ian brought the subject up again and again, each time with a little more insistence, and then finally, Michelle agreed. On Valentine's Day 2015, with enough cold medicine and alcohol in her system to lower her inhibitions, Michelle had sex with a stranger that she believed Ian had recruited on Craigslist. What Michelle didn't know was that Ian had filmed the entire sexual encounter, and then afterward he wanted to watch it with her. Michelle was horrified. She begged Ian to destroy this video, but Ian refused and said, "No one forced you to do it." But despite these huge issues in their relationship, they did not cause the couple to end their engagement. In fact, these issues only seemed to bring the couple closer together, if for the wrong reasons. As Ian became more and more controlling of Michelle, Michelle became more and more emotionally dependent on Ian. And so with that in mind, in June of 2015, 8 months before their wedding date, Ian and Michelle took out a mortgage together, and they moved into a brand new 2-story condo in downtown Anaheim, California. It was Michelle who came up with the entire $14,400 down payment, but she didn't care. She and Ian were both so excited about a change of scenery to hopefully get their relationship back on track. Just weeks after moving in, all of the excitement of the new place was gone, and in its place were all of their old unresolved issues. Soon, minor disagreements became major arguments, and major arguments turned into vicious accusations of infidelity and betrayal. Finally, the fights turned physical. When Michelle threatened to leave, he held her down on the bed while she tried to kick and claw her way free. Families on both sides of the warring couple had the same advice. You are not good for each other, you need to end it. So at the end of August, just 2 months after Ian and Michelle had purchased the condo together, Ian took back the engagement ring he had given Michelle, and Michelle packed up her Volkswagen Jetta and drove off to stay with her parents. But as much as Michelle and Ian now wanted out of their relationship, as long as they owned that condo together, they could not entirely sever ties. Michelle wanted Ian to sell the condo so she could get reimbursed for the down payment she had made, but Ian liked the condo and had no intention of moving out. This put them at a sort of standstill and kind of forced them to continue interacting despite being broken up. And surprisingly, through their somewhat regular exchanges over this property, they learned how to be cordial again. Ian would text Michelle first about the property, and then he would follow up and ask how she was doing, and Michelle would do the same thing to Ian. Even though this did not get them anywhere closer to solving their condo issue, it seemed like they were at least at a point where they could treat each other with respect. However, this would not last. On September 10th, so 1 month after Michelle had moved out and when the condo issue was still completely unresolved, Ian received a very strange and upsetting message from Michelle. In between friendly, cordial text messages, Michelle sent him a long, bizarre, rambly email that could only be described as biblical in her condemnation of the man she once wanted to marry. She wrote, "Your sins are many, including defiling me and my family with your wicked and evil sexual acts, your financial coercion and irresponsibility, your gluttony, your greed, your lust, your sloth, your wrath, your envy, and most of all, your pride." She finished it with, "You may try to hide behind the law of man, but it is a weak shield that will bend and crack against the sword of God. I will bring the full force of the law and the word of God against you to judge you." Ian knew that Michelle and her family were religious, and he knew from their relationship that Michelle was prone to emotional outbursts. But even by her standards, this email revealed a vengefulness that he had not seen before. Ian was so shaken up by it that the very next day, on September 11th, Ian filed a restraining order against Michelle. After reading the email and speaking with Ian, the judge did not grant the restraining order against Michelle. However, Ian's request had now brought Michelle to the notice of the Anaheim police. Shocked that she had even been the subject for a restraining order, Michelle immediately hired an attorney to handle all interactions with Ian, and Ian would hire an attorney as well. And by November of 2015, the lawyers were finally able to work out a compromise with the condo that would allow Michelle and Ian to finally move on from each other. The deal stated that Michelle would not get back her $14,400 down payment. Instead, she would continue to pay half the mortgage for 6 months. But after that, Ian would either assume full responsibility for the mortgage, or he would have to agree to sell the condo and split the profits with Michelle. Even though neither side was fully happy with this arrangement, they both were just exhausted from all the fighting and were ready to just accept it and move on. And so they both signed the agreement, and then the 6-month timer began. Ian stayed in the condo, and Michelle, who was living with her parents, decided to get her own small apartment and go back to school to get her master's in business. In January 2016, just a month or so after the condo settlement was finalized, Ian Diaz met another young woman through a dating site. Her name was Angela Connell. She was roughly the same age as Michelle, and she was looking for a serious relationship. When she and Ian finally met in person, they both liked what they saw. During their first date, Ian was honest with Angela and told her that he had just recently gotten out of an engagement that had ended very badly, but he was still certain he wanted to get married and raise a family, which was very reassuring to Angela. Only 1 month later, Ian and Angela would get married, and Angela would move into Ian's condo, the same condo he had bought with Michelle. In May, just 4 months after meeting Ian and 2 months away from the deadline for Ian to assume paying the full mortgage on the condo or sell the property, Angela surprised her husband with a sonogram and announced that she was pregnant with twins. The couple was beyond excited. They sent copies of the sonogram of the twins to family and friends, and Angela wasted no time prepping their home for the twins' arrival. Everything had moved quickly, but the couple was very excited at the prospect of starting a family together. Later that month, on May 22nd, Angela was at the condo alone when she hopped on her computer to check her email. Once her inbox loaded, she noticed there was an email from a man named Jason Ray. She didn't recognize the name, but at first glance, it looked like a real email from a real person, not some spam message, so she clicked on it to see what it was. And the words she read sent a chill through her body. The email was definitely not spam. It was a personal message intended for Angela, and whoever this Jason person was clearly knew personal details about her and her husband. The email, which was littered with biblical references, explained to Angela that Ian had been unfaithful to her and that he didn't love her and he never would. Jason also told her that Ian was going to harm her if she didn't leave him immediately. And the email closed by telling Angela that she and her husband had sinned against God. Angela stared at her computer screen for quite a while, wondering what she should do. Eventually, after reading it a few more times, she decided it had to be some sort of sick joke and that the best thing to do was just to ignore it. So she deleted the email, shut her computer, and she walked away. The next morning, Angela logged back onto her computer, and when she opened her email, there was a new email from Jason Ray sitting at the top of her inbox. Angela thought about not even opening it and just deleting it, but her curiosity got the better of her and she clicked it open. Once again, the message was aimed at trying to convince Angela to leave Ian. It was full of biblical references, and at certain points it didn't even make any sense. But there was a new twist to this email versus the one she had received the day before. In this email, the sender, Jason, clearly references Michelle, Ian's ex. Jason would write that Angela was Ian's Eve, and Michelle was Ian's Lilith. According to a particular interpretation of Jewish folklore, Lilith was the first wife of Adam from the famous Adam and Eve story. But Lilith was banished from the Garden of Eden for disobeying Adam, at which point God made Eve out of Adam's rib, and then Eve became Adam's wife. While somewhat confusing, the message Jason was sending Angela was fairly clear. Angela was not meant to be Ian's wife. Ian's true wife was Michelle. Angela didn't know anything about Ian's ex, Michelle. All she really knew was her name and that she existed. But despite the lack of insight into who Michelle was, Angela couldn't help but think, this email sounds an awful lot like something a deeply scorned lover would send. And so that night when Ian got home, Angela showed him the latest email from Jason Ray and told him, I think this is your ex, Michelle. At first, Ian was confused. He and Michelle had settled their issues. They had moved on, so why would she write this? But after reading the email a few more times and seeing all the over-the-top biblical language that Michelle had previously used in emails to him, he became convinced as well that this probably was Michelle. However, he told Angela that Michelle was very mercurial and that she must have just gotten worked up about something and she's overreacted. That's why she sent these emails, and she's likely to calm back down and they will never hear from her again. However, he told Angela if the emails do continue, please let him know and he would go to the police. For the next several days, Angela checked her email, but no strange emails came through. But roughly a week after that first Jason Ray email arrived, Angela received another email from Jason Ray, and this time the subject line simply said, die. The body of the message read, I hope you are scared of death tomorrow. Be prepared, don't sleep. Be watchful of the daughters of God. We will steal your child and we will watch as it dies. Within minutes of receiving this email, Angela received a barrage of others from Jason Ray, as well as from other account names she didn't recognize, like Lilith Truth. And all of these messages included the threat that Angela was going to be harmed in the coming days, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Angela was horrified and was starting to wonder if this really was something Michelle could be doing. It just felt so evil. Then she noticed at the bottom of one of the emails she had just received that it literally said, from Michelle. It looked like the signature had been automatically entered into the email template, and then Michelle must have just forgotten to delete it before sending. Or, as Angela and Ian stared at it and discussed what it could mean, they thought, well, maybe she left it in on purpose. Maybe she wants us to know this is from her. Either way, at that point, Ian and Angela felt fairly certain that Michelle was really behind this, and so they printed out all of the nasty emails Angela had received to date, and they took that along with the email Michelle had sent Ian the year before that was very biblical in nature, and they took all of that to the courthouse, and Ian would file another restraining order against Michelle. A few days later, on June 6th, 2 police officers went to Michelle's residence and literally handed her the order to appear in court for this restraining order. The date was set for June 17th. But that night, and over the course of the next several days leading up to this court appearance, Angela continued to receive dozens of emails from Jason Ray and Lilith Truth and other anonymous accounts threatening to make her pay for having filed this restraining order. Even though Ian told Angela that there was just no way Michelle was actually going to hurt her, Angela couldn't help but feel terrified and was afraid to leave the house. Finally, June 17th arrived, and Angela and Ian arrived at the court alongside a huge group of friends and family members who were there to support them. When Michelle walked in with her lawyer, she was met with boos and hisses from all of these supporters, and then once court was called to session, Angela and Ian outlined what had been happening over the last couple of weeks, and they showed the judge the stack of all these emails. The judge reviewed the documents and then turned to Michelle and asked her what she had to say for herself. And she would say, "I didn't send those emails. I don't know what's going on. I didn't do this." But the judge wasn't buying it, especially given the fact that Ian had previously filed for a restraining order against Michelle for threatening emails. And so this time, the judge did grant the restraining order, prohibiting Michelle from having any further contact with Ian or Angela. Angela and Ian were thrilled, and when they walked out of the courtroom, they felt confident that this nightmare was finally behind them. But within hours of getting home, Angela started receiving more emails, and immediately they contacted the Anaheim police to report that Michelle was already violating her restraining order. But since the emails they were receiving now were not signed by Michelle, there was no way for the police to prove that Michelle was in fact violating her restraining order. And so for several days, the ferocious, threatening, biblical emails continued, and there was seemingly nothing Ian or Angela could do to stop it. Then, as if it wasn't stressful enough, Angela received an email from an account she had not seen before, inquiring about her rape fantasy request on Craigslist. Angela did not understand what this person was talking about, but eventually, when she went online and investigated, she discovered there was an entire marketplace of people posting ads on Craigslist seeking partners to take part in a rape fantasy. And someone had clearly been pretending to be Angela and was going into these places on Craigslist and responding to all of these ads saying that she, Angela, was interested. And then she would leave them her address and what she looked like and what her daily habits were like. And according to some of these men that were reaching out now to Angela, apparently whoever was doing this was indicating that Angela didn't just want to be a part of some basic rape fantasy. She wanted to be attacked out in public, and she was encouraging these men to follow her and stalk her and then attack her and rape her. And even if she tried to say stop, don't. Angela knew Michelle had to be behind this, but again, there was just no evidence tying these rape fantasy responses to Michelle because she wasn't signing her name to them. And so despite how absolutely horrifying it was to learn this was going on, there was nothing the police could do to stop it. For Angela, this was a nightmare. The stress and the fear of this situation was just so much that she basically just hid in her condo all day long. But on June 24th, so 1 week after the court appearance and just a couple of days after first learning about this rape fantasy ad, Angela had to leave the condo to go out and run a few errands. And so she gathered up her things and she called Ian, who was at work, to let him know that she was heading out in case anything happened to her. And then she left her condo. She went downstairs to the large parking garage underneath their development where residents could park their cars. She hopped in her car and she drove up the ramp out onto the street and then went about her day, running her different errands, and it was totally uneventful. At some point when she was done, she made her way back to the condo complex. She went down the ramp into the underground parking garage. She found her way back to her assigned parking spot. She parked. She got out of her vehicle, she shut the door, and she began walking from her car to the door on the far side of the garage that would lead to the stairwell back up to her actual condo. But when she got maybe 30 feet away from this door, she heard movement coming from behind her. She turned around and she saw there was this man who she didn't recognize who was walking very quickly toward her, and because she was already completely on edge, given all these threats she's been receiving, threats of bodily harm, threats of rape, she immediately screamed and started running towards this door that would take her to the stairwell. But before she could open the door and get inside, this man had lunged and grabbed her around the neck, and he was trying to pull her to the ground, and he was trying to pull her clothes off. And Angela began punching and kicking and screaming and biting, doing anything she could. And eventually she was able to fight this person off of her, and he quickly turned and ran away. And then Angela quickly picked up her stuff. She ran into the door, ran upstairs, got into her condo, and as soon as her door had shut and locked behind her, she picked up her phone and she dialed 911. And she was so hysterical that when she talked to the dispatcher, they couldn't understand what was happening, but eventually she was able to tell them what had happened and to please come out here and help her. And then a little while later, when the police showed up, they found Angela still totally hysterical in her condo. Her shirt had been ripped in half and she had red spots all around her neck from where this guy had grabbed her. But overall, she was okay. The police would search the building, but there was no sign of her attacker. However, Angela would tell police that she was fairly confident she understood what had just happened. She explained what was going on with her and her husband's ex, Michelle, and how despite this restraining order against her, she was clearly signing Angela up for these rape fantasies on Craigslist. And so most likely this man who had attacked Angela down in the garage was only there because of this rape fantasy ad. The police took down her statement, and then that night they would go to Michelle's residence and they would show her a search warrant that authorized them to search all of her devices, her phone, her laptop, all of them. And when Michelle turned them over and gave up all of her passwords, the police were able to find enough evidence that she was behind the harassment of Angela and Ian that they arrested her on the spot. Angela and Ian were relieved when they heard the news, and that night, while Michelle was in jail, the threatening emails completely stopped. However, the following day, Michelle posted bail, and within hours of her being free again, Jason Ray and Lilith Truth began bombarding Angela's inbox again. Angela was so distraught, she went to the doctor for a checkup, worried that her stress would negatively affect her pregnancy. And to her horror, the doctor would tell her that she had actually lost the twins. She had miscarried. And if that wasn't horrible enough, the doctor also discovered that her cervical cancer, which had been in remission, was now back. While Angela and Ian grieved the loss of their unborn children and wondered what they would do about Angela's cancer, the horrible emails continued. And men kept showing up at their front door, asking to come inside for violent sex with Angela. Finally, on July 13th, so roughly 2 weeks since Angela was attacked in the parking garage, Angela looked out of her window and she saw there was this young man kind of lurking on the side of their condo complex, and he appeared to be hiding. Worried this guy was going to ambush her as soon as she walked outside, she called the police. The police showed up and they spoke to the young man, who would confirm he was there because he was responding to a rape fantasy ad. He said the woman inside, Angela, had told him to come here and have his way with her. After this incident, Ian was completely fed up and he demanded the police do something about this. You need to go arrest Michelle and keep her behind bars. And sure enough, the next day, Michelle was arrested again. But this time, her bail was set for $1 million, making it impossible for her to make bond. Angela and Ian finally were able to breathe a sigh of relief, although they didn't know exactly what she would be charged with or what the legal outcomes would be. For the time being, so long as Michelle was in jail, they knew they were safe. Except Michelle was completely innocent. Yes, she did send that first fire and brimstone biblical email the year before in September, the one that led to Ian filing that first restraining order request that was denied. But after that, she had lawyered up and not had any contact with Ian or his new wife. In fact, the first time Michelle had ever even laid eyes on Angela Diaz was on June 17th when Michelle was in court for that second restraining order request against her, which caught her completely by surprise. She had totally moved on with her life at that point and was dating other people and focusing on school, so when she was asked to come in and defend herself in court, she barely knew what to say. It didn't make any sense. And then when Michelle was arrested for the second time and couldn't make bail and so had to just sit in jail till her court date, her family hired a lawyer to investigate and figure out who was actually behind the harassment, because it wasn't Michelle. And what their lawyer would discover was truly shocking. Every horrible, threatening email that was sent to Angela's inbox was sent by Angela. The rape fantasy ads on Craigslist? Angela. The supposed attempted rape attack on Angela in her parking garage? That was completely made up. It never happened. She made those marks on her neck. She ripped her clothes off. It had all been an elaborate setup by Angela and by Ian. They had been in on this together. At the time they launched this frame job of Michelle, they were only a few weeks away from that 6-month deadline that Ian had to either sell the condo and split the profits with Michelle or take over the whole mortgage. And apparently, Ian and Angela believed their plan would result in Michelle losing her claim to the condo, and their legal agreement around the condo would become null and void, thereby saving Ian from being forced to sell the condo or having to potentially pay a higher price for it. The pair were so convinced this plan was going to work that Angela even lied about being pregnant. It was all a ruse to make it seem like Michelle's harassment had led Angela to lose her pregnancy. She was also lying about having cancer. Michelle's lawyer quickly uncovered lots of these holes in Ian and Angela's plan, and finally, after Michelle had sat in prison for 89 days after that second time she was arrested, she was released. On Tuesday, October 17th, 2017, Angela Diaz pleaded guilty to 10 felony and 22 misdemeanor charges, including kidnapping, false imprisonment, and falsely reporting a crime to a peace officer. She was sentenced to 5 years in state prison. Ian Diaz was not charged with any crimes at the time and continued in his job as a U.S. Marshal. But 2 years later, on December 20th, 2019, Michelle filed a civil rights lawsuit against Ian, alleging that he was in fact the mastermind of the plot that resulted in her wrongful imprisonment. She also brought charges against the Anaheim Police Department for their failure to properly follow up on evidence they discovered early in the investigation that showed the threatening emails Michelle was accused of sending, in fact, originated from the Diaz household. On Friday, May 3rd, 2021, the Anaheim police announced they had reached an undisclosed cash settlement with Michelle, and then a little over a week later, on May 13th, Ian Diaz was arrested and charged the following day with 1 count of conspiracy to commit cyberstalking, 1 count of cyberstalking, and 1 count of perjury for his false testimony in a deposition in connection with a federal civil lawsuit. If convicted, Ian faces a maximum penalty of 5 years in prison on each of the counts. His case is still pending. Since her public exoneration back in 2017, Michelle has gone on to finish her MBA, she has left California, and she found a great job in marketing with a beauty company. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please convince the 5-star review button to get a very large, intricate tattoo that they were on the fence about getting, and then once they follow through and get it, shrug your shoulders and tell them, meh, I don't like it very much. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and everywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallin, and I really do check the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballin.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.